Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to today's invitation-only trainer preview for EndNote 20 on Windows. Thanks for joining me. My name is Jimmy McCollery, Digital Education Specialist at Clarivate, primarily focusing on developing EndNote training materials. Before my current role, I was an EndNote product support representative for about 17 years. I wanted to mention to everyone before we get started that I'll send a video recording of today's webinar to all registrants. Typically, I send out the link to the recording within 24 hours. If you find yourself needing to drop off before the end of the session, or if we happen to run a bit long, feel free to drop and you can review the rest of the webinar at your convenience with the recording link. As we proceed through our agenda, feel free to ask questions in the chat during the class, and we'll cover as many of those questions as possible at the end of our session. Now, you might notice a Q&A panel on your WebEx window. I ask if you please don't use this part of the interface to pose questions. For whatever reason, when you're screen sharing as a presenter using WebEx, the Q&A interface is somewhat buried, and I might end up missing submissions to the Q&A panel. So again, if a question comes up, please feel free to post that in the primary chat window, and we will circle back around to get those questions answered. Today, I'll be walking through some essential EndNote functions, pointing out improvements and workflow changes along the way. The primary enhancements in EndNote 20 focus on a new interface design, an improved PDF reading experience, new workflow enhancements, and new options for performing a duplicate search. And again, most of these items will come across sort of naturally in the flow of our lesson. A couple of points I will mention toward the end of our lesson that don't really fit the flow, but again, I'll be sure to point out any of the primary differences and enhancements that you'll find in EndNote 20. With that said, I think we're ready to dive in, so I'm going to go ahead and close out of my title slide here. And we're going to launch right into the EndNote application. So I've got a fresh installation on my computer here. As you'd find in previous versions of EndNote, EndNote doesn't make a shortcut on your desktop by default. That's something you can create if you'd like. You can launch EndNote like any other application from your start menu, performing a search from the Cortana search field on the Windows 10 taskbar, or through the EndNote 20 tab that you'll find in Microsoft Word if you're a Word user. We can see the primary difference just upon launch is that that default gray background window is no longer part of the EndNote application. The window that we're seeing on the screen here is the replacement of that window. This window would only appear if, oh, I see someone's having an audio issue. If anyone else might be able to let me know in the chat if you can hear me, that'd be great. Again, it looks like someone's having an audio. Okay, someone mentioned the audio is fine. Give me just a moment. I want to let this person know that the audio issue is just for them. I do apologize. Just one moment. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't want to leave the person hanging and make them think that it was the entire session. But thanks for everyone for letting me know that my audio is coming through. So like I was mentioning, the gray background window is no longer part of the EndNote 20 application. That window, especially from my days in EndNote product support, would confuse new users if someone might not have invested some time up front in an EndNote class. That gray window might have caused someone to think that EndNote wasn't functioning correctly. So this window that we're seeing here is sort of the first launch window. This window would come up anytime you don't have a library open in the EndNote application. So you'll find that once we open a library, this screen isn't hidden behind the library. This particular part of the interface only appears if you are in the EndNote application without a library open. And to get started with the EndNote application, I could either open a library that I've already created in the past. I could open a library that someone might have sent to me, maybe via email or Dropbox. I could open a shared library that someone added me. If someone added me to a sharing team, I could open that from EndNote, just like previous versions. Or I can create a new EndNote library. That's what I'm going to start with today. We see that we have a shortcut to create a library right on the interface here. We've got the option to either create a library or open an existing library. All of the drop-down menus still function as expected that you would find in previous versions of EndNote. So to create a new library, I could go to File and I could choose the New command, or just right from this screen, I can click on Create a New Library. I'll go ahead and do that today. I'll click the button here. And again, just like previous versions of EndNote, all EndNote would want me to do when creating a library is to choose a location for this library that I'm creating and to give this library a name. The sort of previous concepts are still in place for where you would want to save a library that you're actively developing. When you're in the process of building an EndNote library, you don't want it to live on a network drive. If you save a library that you're actively developing to a network drive, that can increase your risk of encountering library corruption, and it can also cause performance issues in the EndNote application due to, maybe perhaps a network latency if there's a slowdown on the network causing EndNote to take longer to read and write to that library. So I'm going to be sure that I'm saving this library to my local drive. The other stipulation or caveat is that you don't want to save a library that you're actively developing to a third-party sync folder. So that means if you're in the process of building a library, you don't want it to live in a Dropbox folder, Google Drive, OneDrive. These sync utilities will also increase your risk of encountering library corruption due to the order in which these sync utilities synchronize files in their folders. The files get synced in an order that doesn't comport to the order in which EndNote is writing to files related to your library. So before we proceed, I just want to reiterate that backups can be saved to network drives or sync folders, but libraries that you're actively developing, you don't want them to live on a network drive and you don't want them to exist in a sync folder. You can see that EndNote has taken me to my Documents folder. I've created an EndNote folder in Documents just to help keep things organized. If I go into that EndNote folder, we see a series of subfolders. I've created a Libraries folder in here, again, just to sort of keep things organized for myself. I'm going to navigate into Libraries. The default name that EndNote recommends for a library is My EndNote Library, and that name is perfectly fine, but I usually recommend assigning some sort of unique name, really whatever you'd like, just something that's somewhat unique for your own use. Now, we do recommend storing all of your EndNote or your research materials in a single EndNote library. It is personal preference whether you take that approach to your EndNote usage or whether you create separate libraries for different projects or different focus areas in your field of study. I'm going to approach my EndNote usage for this new library with the concept that I will be storing all of my materials in a single library. So I'm going to give it an overarching name of My Research Projects. Now that I've got my location set and the name designated for this particular library, I'm going to go ahead and press Save here. All right, so we've got a new library on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and maximize it just to get a better use of my screen real estate. Before we start taking a look at the various components that comprise an EndNote 20 library window, I just wanted to point out a couple of changes to the drop-down menus. We've got an additional drop-down menu here at the top of the EndNote 20 interface called Library, where we've tried to sort of harmonize a lot of the commands pertaining to the library window under a dedicated drop-down menu. So you'll find some of the items that might have existed on the Tools drop-down now appear on this Library drop-down. The other primary difference with regard to the drop-down menus is that content files have been moved from the Edit drop-down to the Tools drop-down. So if you went to go edit an output style or an import filter, previously in EndNote X9 and earlier, you would have gone to the Edit dropdown. Those items you're going to find, again, on the Tools dropdown menu. Now, this is a blank library window, and EndNote Library is essentially your database of references. For me to better illustrate the various panels that comprise an EndNote library window, I actually want to switch gears and open the sample library that installs with the EndNote application. So if you happen to be following along and you've just created a new library, feel free to leave that open. You don't have to go find the sample library like I'm going to do here. But again, because the sample library already has some groups and references and a couple of file attachments in it already, it's just going to help me better illustrate the various panels that comprise an EndNote library window. So I'm going to leave this library open, and I'm going to open a second library by clicking the File dropdown at the top of the EndNote 20 interface, where we've got the menu item for Open Library. I'm going to choose that. The sample library is still in the same location that you would have found it in for EndNote X9 and earlier. Before we move on, I just wanted to point out, that an EndNote library consists of two components. That's the same as previous versions of EndNote. So the library that's currently displayed on screen behind this dialog window, that we see that it has an ENL file associated to it and a data folder. You can think of, in terms of EndNote libraries, that the ENL file is the door to the warehouse. The data folder is really the warehouse where all of the library information is stored. You need to make sure that you keep both of these items together. You never want to, move one of the two items to a separate location. Back in my EndNote product support days, I've spoke to a lot of users who, again, might not have taken a class like this and may not realize how important the data folder is, and if you delete that data folder, EndNote will try to make a fresh copy of it, but the resulting library will be missing elements such as groups, file attachments, and possibly recently entered references. So again, I just wanted to point out the importance of both of the library components and keeping them together. So to find that sample library on Windows, I'm going to go ahead and just navigate to my C drive. So if I go ahead and expand this PC, we've got a shortcut to my C drive. Now I'm going to, the sample items are in a shared public documents folder, but the easiest way to track them down is to go to my EndNote 20 program folder first. So here on my C drive, I'm going to navigate to Program Files x86. This is where EndNote traditionally is installed because it's a 32-bit application. In Program Files x86, we have my EndNote 20 program folder. I'm going to open that. And then we see a shortcut. It's not a subfolder. It's a shortcut to the examples folder. I'm going to double click on this. And I just wanted to point out the true path to these example items. We see here at the top, it's under the C drive within users. There's a sort of a catch-all general user account called public. Inside of public are folders that any user account on the workstation could access. So this location is doubly important if you're working in a lab setting or a library setting where you have multiple users sharing workstations. This particular part of the drive is a location that any user would be able to access so that everyone can utilize these training resources to learn about EndNote. We see here in the examples folder, there's a compressed EndNote library, or what's also referred to as an archived EndNote library called sample library 20.enlx. This library format is a bit different than what we just looked at, where we saw the standalone ENL file and data folder. This is a compressed file. If you're familiar with zip files, this is pretty much a customized zip file. It's the type of file that can contain more than one item. This format is really handy for backup purposes because, again, it's just one item you would need to keep track of. And if you were to open this compressed library, EndNote would automatically extract the contained ENL file and data folder and then display that library on the screen. So that's what I'm going to do. I want to open this sample library. To open it, I could either double click on this file or I could just single click and choose open, either way. And again, when I open it, EndNote extracts the two library components and then shows me the library on the screen. So we've got a library open that already has some groups and references and file attachments. Before we start looking at the components, I did just want to point out one of the other major differences in EndNote 20 is that each library is a separate window to lessen confusion. If you are working with multiple libraries in previous versions of EndNote, you were sort of restricted to a single application window. You might end up having libraries overlapped. If you weren't aware of what was currently open, you might not realize that multiple libraries were open. That might cause some confusion. So we see down here on my taskbar, currently I have two libraries open. I've got my blank library that I started with at the beginning of the lesson here, and then I've got the sample library on a separate window. So again, makes it a lot easier to transition or shift between separate libraries if you do choose to work with multiple libraries for different projects or, again, different areas of focus in your field of study. I'm going to go ahead and close the sample, excuse me, not the sample library, but the new library that I created just to keep things streamlined during our lesson today. So I'm going to go back just temporarily to that new blank library, and I can either, X off the window here, or I could go to File, Close Library, either way. I'm going to go and use the X. It's a little bit easier just for the lesson here. But again, you can also close a library from the File drop-down. Okay, so we're back to the sample library that installs with the EndNote application. The contents of this sample library have been refreshed. We've got some more up-to-date references, in the sample library just for example purposes. And we've also got a couple of, public domain file attachments, journal articles that can be used, again, for just tutorial purposes. Before we move on, I did want to mention that, if you were to edit a content file as well, like if you were maybe opening a style to make changes to it, things like that, they too would also appear as separate program windows. Again, makes it a lot easier to work between various aspects of the EndNote application by having each window as sort of its own separate interface, a dedicated tab that you would find on the taskbar at the bottom of the screen. So in a single EndNote library here, like I was mentioning, you can have, if you have multiple libraries open, each one will exist as a separate window. But another enhancement that was added to EndNote 20 is the ability to open groups or group sets in a single library on separate tabs to make it easier if you are working with a single EndNote library like we recommend, make it a little bit easier to switch between different projects or different sets of references so that you don't lose your previous set if you did want to take a look at something else. So we see here at the top, excuse me, at the top of the EndNote library window that we're on, we see the little plus symbol here where I could open another tab. I could click on the plus and again, takes me to another tab of the same library where I can manually navigate elsewhere. I can also open another tab by right-clicking on a group or a group set here in the Groups panel. So like, for instance, I'm going to go ahead and close this tab here just for a moment. But let's say I wanted to take a look at my groups that I have for a particular project pertaining to avian intelligence. I could right-click on the overarching group set if I'd like, and on the contextual menu, I've got the option to open a new tab. Left-click on that. We see that that opens here. And maybe today I will also be working a little bit on my bats project, and I want to be sure make it easy to, again, switch between the two groups without losing a previous display. So I could click on my bats group set or a particular group within the overarching group set. Maybe I just want to look at the Chiroptera group within the bats group set. I can right-click on that. I've got the option to open this in the new tab. So again, it's really easy to switch between various elements of your EndNote library, so that if you do have multiple projects in a single library, you can have everything on one dedicated application window, but be able to switch between different aspects or different elements of the groups structure that you've created to make it easy to switch between projects. We've got on the EndNote 20 library interface, the traditional reference list panel that's been redesigned just a little bit. You still have up to 10 display columns that you can show here in the middle of your library on what we call the reference list panel. These display columns, you can, just like in EndNote X9, if you're familiar with EndNote X9, you can drag and drop the display columns if you'd like to reorder them in terms of which column appears where on the display panel. We've got a quick shortcut that was added to EndNote 20 here. You'll see when you point your mouse over the display column labels, you've got this little gear icon, and if you left-click on that, it'll take you right to the Display Fields tab, where again you've got the 10 display columns that you can reconfigure. One difference related to the display columns, the default display columns, is that we're no longer including the read or unread status as a default display column, and we're no longer including the rating column as a default display column. Those are both still present. If you like the read or unread status, that's something you can turn back on. It's one of the options here in EndNote 20 as well. Same goes for the rating column. If you'd like to assign a 5-star rating to your references, that's still an option. It's just not one of the defaults here. But maybe let's say I want to also display, the label field information. I can set one of these unused display columns perhaps to the field that I'd prefer. So let's say in this instance I want it to be label. I could choose that from the list here. And if I press OK, we see that it updates my display column accordingly. So very similar concept here, in terms of the reference list panel. Now, in previous versions of EndNote, as you were clicking on the reference list panel here, you could double-click a reference and it would open up a standalone edit reference window. That's no longer present here in EndNote 20. We've all of our design changes that we've made to EndNote 20, the decisions were informed by extensive focus group testing that our EndNote product team conducted with both longtime EndNote users and even new users and non-users, just to get the opinion of real-world users in terms of how they feel about these changes. And again, all of our decisions were informed by their feedback. So we've sort of did away with the standalone edit reference window from the library display itself. If you double-click one of the entries here, you'll get what we call the sort of the tabs panel on the right side of the library window, where you'll see a summary of the information pertaining to this particular reference. And we're able to show, even though this interface is sort of streamlined, simplified, sort of modernized, we're actually, with this approach, able to show more vital information front and center than we've ever been able to in past versions of EndNote. So again, as I'm clicking around on the references here in the reference list panel, you see the summary tab updating to show pertinent details for that type of reference. If you have access to Web of Science and you've got a reference in your library that's indexed by the Web of Science, at the bottom of the summary tab, we've got some shortcuts back to the source record in the Web of Science if you wanted to look at this particular entry that's indexed in the Web of Science. Or if you want to look at related records, that would be other references indexed in the Web of Science that have at least one reference in common with the source record, you would be able to quickly get to that here, just right from the summary tab. So again, the standalone edit reference window is gone. If you want to edit a reference, right here from the tabs panel, you've got an edit tab. This is similar. We've sort of renamed it. It had been called the reference tab, in previous versions of EndNote. But the edit tab here on the tabs panel will show you the underlying metadata for any given reference, not just the 10 display columns. You'll be able to see all of the information stored in a particular reference. And this interface is, modifiable. So if you wanted to fix a typo or add a bit of information that wasn't already present, or delete information you have no interest in storing, you would be able to do, all of those changes here, right here from the edit tab. And again, you'd be able to save the change in real time, and that would be stored in your library, permanently until you made further changes. At the bottom, if we switch back to the summary tab, at the bottom of the summary tab, we have a preview tab. This is, again, is a similar element that you would have found in previous versions of EndNote. The preview tab gives you a quick preview of how a particular reference would be formatted with a given output style. Right now, you can see that I'm previewing what is called the annotated style. This is the default style in EndNote, sort of a generic author date style that includes abstracts when available. If I wanted to change that, I can click the drop-down right here on the preview panel, and I've got a list of favorite connection files that have been pre-configured so that they're available on a short list. If I wanted to look at all of my output styles, I can choose select another style. The Choose a Style window, we actually see a new quick search field. If I wanted to type in a couple of letters at the start of the style's name, I can quickly jump to a particular style here just using this quick search. EndNote still installs about, EndNote 20 installs about 500 of our most popular output styles, but we've just crossed the 7,000 style threshold. So if there was a particular style that you were looking for that wasn't part of this default list, you can visit endnote.com and you can check out the downloads page. That's where you'll find our online output style repository. And again, if there was a style that you were looking for, a particular, for a particular journal, or just a set of formatting guidelines, if you couldn't find it here on the Choose a Style window, check our online style repository. There's a good chance that we have the style available to download from the repository, and that's something that you can add to your EndNote installation. And I just wanted to mention, whether it be yourself or one of your users, if someone comes across a set of guidelines that we have no predefined output style for, as long as you know how you'd like your references to be outputted, our EndNote product support representatives would be happy to help find an existing style that's somewhat close to what you're looking for, and then help modify that further so that you can get EndNote to output references according to the guidelines that you need to apply to your writing project. So I did want to mention we've got that flexibility to customize output styles. Excuse me, still here in EndNote 20. I'm going to quickly go ahead and maybe change to the JAMA output style for my preview. So I've just typed a couple of letters in to the list here. Something you could do in EndNote X9 and earlier. I could double click on the entry here. I could single click and press choose either way. All right, we see that we've got the updated preview here. Maybe I'll go ahead and shrink this down just a little bit to get a better use of my screen real estate. That looks good. And then a new addition to the preview panel is a shortcut to copy a formatted reference automatically. This command historically is called copy formatted. If we actually look for it off of the preview tab, we would find it here on the references drop-down menu. It had been on the edit drop-down previously, but the command is now on the references drop-down here in EndNote 20, and it's actually been renamed a little bit. It had been called copy formatted. To make it a little bit clearer, it's now called copy formatted reference. So this is something if I wanted to take a highlighted reference here on my reference list panel and generate, a standalone plain text reference, I could choose, again, the command here from the references drop-down, or I can just click the shortcut here. And just as an example, if I just open up a notepad window to serve as a destination, I could then perform a paste, and we would get, a plain text reference. So whether it be an email or a Word document, any word processor file, any program or window that would take plain text, I can paste a plain text reference from the EndNote application. I could do it, one by one like I've just done here, or I can highlight multiple references if I wanted to make a sort of an independent standalone bibliography, and I can go to the references drop-down, choose copy formatted reference, and if I go back to my Word document here, my text file here, I could paste that in. And again, this is functionality that you would have found in previous versions of EndNote. I'm just pointing out we've got a shortcut to initiate the command right here on the preview panel. And if you were looking for the menu item, I just wanted to point out that it's now here on the references drop-down. And just to recap, previous versions of EndNote, the tabs panel could be repositioned. You could move this to the bottom of your library window if you'd prefer. Not really the best use of your screen real estate, so that's no longer an option here in EndNote 20. If you want to display the tabs panel, it's always going to be on the right side of the window. But again, you can hide it at any point by clicking the X on the tabs panel here. Gives your reference list panel a little bit more screen real estate. And if you ever want to see that again, you would just really double click on any entry here on the reference list panel. That's going to bring it back to the summary tab. And then again, if you want to edit the underlying details for a reference, you would go to the edit tab here. Excuse me. On the left side of the library window, we've got the groups panel. Not too much has changed here. Very similar functions that you would find in previous versions of EndNote. We've got the default groups that always appear in an EndNote library, such as all references, recently added, unfiled, and trash. Those, again, always exist in an EndNote library. But this sample library has some great examples of group sets, these overarching labels that you might create for different projects or different areas of focus in your field of study. You've got the same, same three library groups that you can create in previous versions of EndNote. We've got the what are called custom groups that are sort of represented by the icons here on the left side of the library window that look like sort of an inbox tray. So the parrots group here is a custom group. That's the type of group that you manually populate. The corvids and parrots example that we see here, this is a combination group. This would be used if you wanted to compare or contrast the contents of two or more groups. And then we also have what are called smart groups, represented by sort of the little magnifying glass icon. Smart groups are automatically populated by EndNote based on a search that you craft at the time of creation of the smart group. You can always go back and edit a smart group or a combination group at a later point if you wanted to reshape the scope of the search to either broaden its scope or narrow the scope. You can do so by editing the smart group or combination group at a later point, again, so that you can change its contents if you prefer. The groups panel, in previous versions of EndNote, you used to be able to completely hide it. I would really, even if you're not using, group sets and library groups for projects, I think it's pretty handy to be able to see these default groups that exist in libraries. So in EndNote 20, you can't completely collapse or hide the groups panel. And I did just want to point out, you could shrink it down a bit, but you can't. There was an issue in older versions of EndNote that would come up in some instances where someone might accidentally completely minimize the groups panel, and if they didn't realize that that had occurred, they might just think that it's sort of gone missing, and they wouldn't be able to see the groups panel unless they restored it. So you can see here, this is about as small as we could shrink it down. So that's just pointing out a difference, is that you can't completely hide the groups panel here in EndNote 20, and I think that's actually a good design decision here. I did want to point out that all of your groups and group sets can be compressed or collapsed in EndNote 20. So if I wanted to just, sort of get a cleaner look, maybe I was working on find full text or online search, and I just wanted to make things look a little bit cleaner here on the groups panel, I can temporarily minimize my overarching my groups label, so that again I can easily see maybe my various online search results, or I can focus on shared groups perhaps. Again, makes it a little bit cleaner. And at any point, if I wanted to see my own groups again, I would just toggle that setting and they all collapse down once more. Excuse me. And the last sort of element that I wanted to point out, just in terms of the library interface, is that we've streamlined how you would modify the display fonts, the font size in EndNote 20. If I go to the Edit drop-down menu, that's still where we would find EndNote's preferences on Windows. So if I go to the Preferences screen again, this is where we had navigated a little bit earlier when we were taking a look at the display fields. But if I go to Display Fonts, instead of choosing various fonts and various sizes for the different elements of the EndNote application or the EndNote interface, we've taken a sort of a streamlined approach that scales perfectly for large monitors. A lot of people work with very large monitors, or maybe even TVs, large TVs these days, that's their computer monitors. So you've got the default size currently in use, but if I wanted to make things a little bit larger, I've got the large option, and if I want to sort of max the size out, I can choose largest. And again, this might be something you would do if you're working with I personally have a 40-inch television that I use for my personal PC, so this might be something just to get the best use of my screen real estate for that television display. I might go ahead and choose the largest. I'm going to leave things as set to the default here, but I did just want to point that out. All right, so switching gears, we're still going to be on the library window, but I want to now perform an online search within the EndNote application. To make things a little bit more streamlined, I'm going to go ahead and close these additional tabs. I just need one tab open at this point. So we're back here just on my All References tab in the same library. You might have noticed how I closed out of the tabs just by clicking on their little X's. We see here in the Groups panel shortcuts to the my favorite connection files, and I've got the ability to display all of my connection files by clicking more. Before we actually initiate a connection, I wanted to mention that the concept of search modes are no longer present in EndNote 20. This is something that had been first introduced, I believe it was in EndNote X2. It had been present in EndNote up to EndNote X9, but we had a search mode where you could perform a search in EndNote, what we called the integrated library and online search mode, that would, when you performed a search, it would just automatically capture all of your search results in your EndNote library. That search mode was best used for targeted searches if you were looking for a particular reference. It would save you a click, because after it was found, it would just be saved to your library automatically. Again, if someone might not have invested some time in a class, if someone performed a broad search on that integrated search mode, they might end up capturing a whole bunch of references they would have no interest in. And if that occurred, at that point, they would have to move the unwanted references to the trash. In those older versions of EndNote, there was a separate search mode called online search mode that functioned as a sort of a temporary library where you can retrieve dozens or hundreds or thousands of references and then pick the ones you'd like to keep. That whole concept, again, we had a lot of training materials for it, but that whole concept really confused a lot of new users. And so we wanted to simplify the approach in EndNote 20. So gone are search modes. Everything is integrated here on this primary library interface. If I wanted to perform an online search here in EndNote, I could click on one of my favorite connection files here on the list within the groups panel. Or again, if I want to see all of my connections, I can press more. Excuse me. On my Choose a Connection window, I do have a quick search, just like we saw on the Choose a Style window. EndNote, still, the default installation installs several hundred of our most popular connection files, but we've got additional connection files available to download on the downloads page at endnote.com. So if there was a particular database you were looking to query, feel free to check our online connection repository. There's a good chance the connection file might be present there and available to download. This may be something everyone's aware of, but for EndNote to be able to establish a connection to a remote database, the remote database has to support a database protocol called Z39.50. If the remote database doesn't support that protocol, EndNote wouldn't be able to establish a connection. And so, for instance, if you prefer Google Scholar, that free web resource for your scholarly searches, they don't support the Z39.50 protocol, which means that you wouldn't be able to make an EndNote connection file for it. So I did want to point that out. A lot of these connection files are digitized card catalogs for universities around the world. Those are the items listed here as library catalog. There are nationally and federally funded databases listed here as well. So for instance, if I scroll down, we've got the Library of Congress connection file. That's a federally funded database here in the United States that almost anyone in the world can connect to. This is really the premier or the quintessential free books database. If you're looking for a book reference, good chance you'll find it here. Another nationally funded database, Libraries Australia, you might be interested in, perhaps if you're in Australia. Today we're going to go ahead and search the PubMed database at the National Library of Medicine. It was one of my shortcuts here. I could have established a connection by clicking on that, but since we found it on this window, I could double click on it to establish the connection, or I can highlight it like I've done and press choose. Either way, I'm going to go and do that. Now, once you've established a connection to the remote database, the search panel here on the EndNote library window is now linked to query the remote database instead of searching for a reference that exists in your EndNote library. Very similar approach that you would have found to previous versions of EndNote. We've got the fields drop down. When you're searching a remote database, the fields that are queryable are determined by the database host or database administrator. So EndNote has no control when you're searching a remote database which fields you can search by. Again, the database administrator would pick whatever fields it is that you're searching by. Today, let's go ahead and let's search PubMed for references in which their title field contains the term sushi. I'm going to be working on a project pertaining to sushi, the food, and just initially I'm going to be casting, a sort of a wide net to find as much research as I can, and maybe narrow that down later as I'm developing the project. I could perform a multi-parameter search here if I wanted to, just like previous versions of EndNote. You've got 3 search parameter fields by default. You don't have to populate all 3. If you did need more than 3 parameters, you could click the plus symbol here and add even more, but I'm going to do a real simple search today. I'll press the search button here, and we see that instead of that confirm online search results window that used to come up where it would show you the range of references and you'd sort of define how many you want, EndNote starts by gathering up to the first 25. And if I wanted more than that, I could toggle that to 50. Maybe I want to see the first 50 references. I can increase that to 75 or 100 if I prefer. Or if I want the entire range to choose from, I could just click on the topmost result, the topmost number in the range. We see that we've actually, in PubMed, we have 169 references that match the scope of my search. And those should come in pretty quickly. So I'll go ahead and click on that complete range here so that I can see all of the results. And again, the difference in searching functionality is that even though I'm on my library window, my online search is sort of a compartmentalized component of the EndNote interface. So I'm currently showing in my online search results 169 references. We can see that none of these have been added to my library just yet. So as I'm reviewing my search results. I can click around on this window here. I can, examine the details in the summary panel. A lot of these references coming from PubMed are going to have abstract information that I would be able to read here on the summary panel. And as I'm deciding which references I want to keep, I would just mark them. I could check the little box here, on the left side of the library, the search results display. And basically, I'm telling EndNote, which references that I want to copy to my library. So I could pick specific references. Perhaps I was going to be going offline, or maybe I do want all of these references in my library to review at a later point. Instead of marking them one by one like I've been doing here, I could just check the this little topmost checkbox. This is sort of the check all or uncheck all toggle. You see, I just clicked it once. It deselected the previous results that I had marked. If I check it or click it one more time, we see that they all become selected. Whenever I'm ready to copy search results to my library, I could then click this little shortcut here. The plus symbol will copy the selected online search results to my local library. So I'm going to go ahead and press this just once. All right, so now we see that we've got some additional references added to this library. They're showing up under recently added. They're also considered unfiled as well, because again, these references aren't yet part of a group, a custom group on my library window. So before we move on, I want to organize these references in a group set structure for this sushi-related project, and I'm going to make a couple of different groups for this project to help me make heads or tails of this, a vast amount of research materials that I've gathered. So before we move on, I'm going to go ahead and create a new group set for this project. To make a group set, just like you would have in previous versions of EndNote, you can go to the Groups drop-down. You can click on Create Group Set, a little bit more than halfway down. I'm going to go and choose this now. I've got my new group set created on the left. Its default name is already selected, which means I could just start typing over it. Any naming convention is perfectly fine, but something related to the project usually makes the most sense, or the particular area of focus in your field of study. I'm going to give this the overarching name Sushi, again, just indicating that all of these items in my library are for a project that I'm developing related to sushi, the food. Now that I've got the name set, I'll just press enter. All right, I've got a new group set created in my library. And by the way, each EndNote library, just like previous versions of EndNote, can store up to 5,000 groups and 5,000 group sets. So there are upper limits, but in the real world, I haven't really seen anyone come near either of those two limits. So I wanted to mention that. Now that I've got my group set created, it's ready to start receiving groups for different purposes or different reasons for this particular project. I want to make a custom group. That's the type of group that you manually populate that's going to serve as a catch-all for all of this research material that I'm gathering. And then that way I can still keep things organized in my library and quickly look at that sort of catch-all group if I want to start examining those references. So with my Sushi group set selected, I'm going to go back to the Groups drop-down menu. I'm going to click on Create Group. This is the command you would choose to create a new custom group. I'll go ahead and choose that. I've got a new group in my Sushi group set. Its default name is selected, which means I can start typing over it. Any naming convention is perfectly fine, but something related to its purpose usually makes the most sense. This is going to be a catch-all for me for this particular project, so I'm going to call it Sushi in general. If I press enter, that sets the name. We can see that it's got the little custom group icon, which signifies that this is the type of group that I manually populate. Now that I've got this created, I could drag and drop any references from my library in this particular custom group so that I can quickly look at only those references at any point. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the unfiled group here. Again, these are the search results in addition to one reference that just hadn't been filed away previously. But I want to select all of these references to associate them with this new custom group. So to do that, I need to make the reference list panel active, and I would just click on any one of these records to make the reference list panel active. Now that it's active, I can perform a select all shortcut. I can either press Control-A, that's the standard Windows select all keyboard shortcut, or I can go to the edit drop-down. I could choose select all from here, either way. Now that I've got my references selected, I could drag and drop them into the new custom group that I created. Or I could, let me just put these in I duplicated them by mistake. There we go. Or if I don't want to do the drag and drop, I can go to the Groups drop-down menu. I can point my mouse over Add References To, and I can choose the custom group from this menu as well. I'll go ahead and use the menu item this time just to make it a little bit clearer. So I'm just going to click on the destination custom group. All right, so we see that we've got all 170 references now associated with this new custom group. Nothing is considered unfiled at this point. And again, this isn't something you have to do, but I like to organize all of my EndNote library materials in a particular project, keep things clear as I'm working on my projects. I treat my unfiled group as my library's inbox, and as I'm adding references, they come in as unfiled, and I like to file them away. It makes it a little bit easier to group references if you do that, because if, let's say, you perform a search for topic A and you capture references and they become unfiled, if you don't file them away and you perform a search for topic B and capture some of those references, at that point you can get multiple topics intermingled under unfiled, and it wouldn't make it impossible to group references at that point. It would just definitely make it a little bit trickier, because you'd have, in that scenario, two different topics, references for two different topics intermingled, and again, make it a little bit trickier. Before we move on, I just want to show you the other two types of groups that I had mentioned just a little bit earlier. I'm going to make a smart group for my sushi project, different reasons why you would make a smart group, but it's really for any time that you want to quickly look at a set of references for whatever, any reason. So whether there be an influential author in your field of study and you want to make sure that person's newly published materials gets spotlighted very quickly, you can make a group that looks for a person's name. If there's a particular area of focus in your field of study that you want to be sure that you're viewing or seeing all newly published research that you're capturing on that topic, you might make a smart group that looks for a particular keyword that would be found in these references. For me, I know that for this particular topic, sushi, if you perform a broad search like I've just done in PubMed, not all of the references found will pertain to sushi the food. Some of these items will be related to a concept called a sushi domain, which is essentially a protein compound. And I know that if my writing project will be focusing on the food, sushi the food, those sushi domain related references I'll have no interest in. So if I make a smart group that looks for that phrase, sushi domain, EndNote will automatically group those references together, so that in my purpose, I could go to that smart group, select those references, and move them to the trash to keep this particular group set clean and organized, containing only references that I might use in my writing project. So for me to make my smart group, I've got my overarching group set selected. I'll go to the Groups drop-down. I'll choose Create Smart Group. All right, so we've got a new smart group interface here. This is where I would name the smart group and define the search that EndNote will perform anytime I edit a reference in my library or add a new reference. Any naming convention is perfectly fine, like I mentioned, but something pertaining to the underlying search usually makes the most sense, so that you can quickly tell its purpose just by reading its name. I'm going to do a real basic search. You can perform a very complex search here. You can search for certain terms or phrases. You've got this drop down where you can, instead of just choosing the default contains option, you can maybe look for a number range. You've got the as less than, or as less than or equal to, as greater than, or as greater than equal to. You can look for a field that begins with or ends with a particular term or phrase, or you could look for a word that begins with a particular base with the option with word begins with. For me, contains is going to do the trick, so I'm going to leave that selected, and I'm just going to define my search phrase, sushi domain. So with this particular smart group, anytime again, I edit a reference or add a reference, and it will perform the search for me in the background. And if EndNote finds a new item that matches the scope of the search, EndNote will put it in the smart group automatically. I'm going to go ahead and press Create. All right, so it looks like none of these items just yet pertain to that I captured from PubMed pertain to sushi domain, but we are going to be doing a Web of Science search in just a moment, so we might see some references start coming in that fit the scope of that search. But I wanted to make that just to show you an example of the smart group function in action here in EndNote 20. The last, I see someone spotted my error here. Let me go back to my Oh, yep. Oh, good. Good catch. Thank you for that. I didn't change the drop down. I rushed. Perfect. Good. Thanks for catching that. So what I did, just to show you here, let's say you did make a smart group. You defined the search incorrectly. If you want it after it's created, you don't have to delete the smart group and come back to it. You would just go ahead and right-click on the smart group. You can go to Edit Group here. Great catch. I missed that here when I'm focusing on the contains dropdown. But yes, I did leave this to author, so perfect catch. Good catch. So what I want to do, of course, that phrase is not going to be found in the default field author. I want to set this to any field so that EndNote will look in any one of the references to find this particular phrase. So I'm going back, I'm editing my search. I've changed this dropdown to any field. I'll press save. There we go. That's what I was expecting. So that was a good catch. I was a little bit worried about that. So we see that EndNote, not only did it look through the 170 references that are in this catch-all sushi and general custom group, it's when you perform a smart group search or when EndNote performs a smart group search, it's looking at all references. So when it's telling me that currently out of my 359 references, that 30 of these match the search that I've crafted for the smart group. So 30 of these references pertain to that concept of a sushi domain. And for me, if I had no use for these references, at any point I can come to the smart group, I can select these items, I can drag them to the trash, keep things nice and organized. But even if I don't trash these references, I can still achieve that same goal. I could still see only the items that were related to sushi, the food, by making a combination group that compares these two groups. So I want to, before we move on, I want to just make a combination group quickly for this particular function. So I've got my overarching sushi group set selected. I'm going to go to the groups drop-down menu one more time. I've got the option create from groups. This is what it's been historically called. This is going to make a combination group. I've got a configuration window that looks somewhat similar to that smart group configuration window. I need to name the combination group. Any naming convention is perfectly fine, but something related to the underlying search usually makes the most sense. So because I want to know what's in sushi in general, but not in sushi domains to see only the items that will most likely pertain to sushi, the food, I'm going to have EndNote look at my sushi in general group. So I'm choosing that from the first group dropdown. Then I need to select the appropriate Boolean operator for this particular function. And because I want to narrow sort of the scope of the search by excluding items that exist in sushi domains, I'm going to choose the not operator here. And for the second dropdown, I'm going to go ahead and choose the sushi domains group. So this is something I can always come back to if I want to, expand or narrow the scope of the search, change its function. I'm going to go ahead and press create. All right, with some simple math, we can sell, 170 minus 30. We've got these 140 items that exist in sushi in general, minus any of the items that exist in this sushi domain smart group. So even if I don't come here and select these references and move them to the trash to keep things streamlined in my particular project here, I could come to my combination group at any point and see, again, the items in this sushi in general custom group that do not contain that phrase sushi domain, again, just to help keep things, streamlined and organized in my EndNote library. So that was a quick example of online search, and just to reiterate, things are pretty similar here in EndNote 20, but the main difference when it comes to online searching is that we've done away with the search modes. Everything's integrated in this particular display. All of your search items are temporary items. They won't exist in your library unless you choose to copy them to your library using this little button here to copy those selected search results to your local EndNote library. I want to perform a direct export example. Nothing has really changed for direct exporting. That function is very similar. The one item or one workflow change, perhaps, that you might think of is that when you perform a direct export, if you've got a single library open, EndNote knows that that's the destination. But if you do have multiple libraries open and they're all minimized, EndNote won't know which library it is that you're looking to send those references to, and it would give you a prompt to choose a library, which, again, you wouldn't get this prompt if you had at least one of your libraries visible on screen. So just to mimic that, I just want to show you, if I open up that blank library that we started with, I'm not actually going to do the direct export with the blank library open, but I just want to show you, if I had two libraries open and I had them both minimized, that would be problematic because EndNote wouldn't know which of the two I would want to send those references to. So again, if you do work with multiple libraries and you have multiple libraries open at once, make sure that your destination library is visible on the screen. It doesn't have to be full screen like this. It just has to be, let me just make this a little smaller. It just has to be sort of visible so that EndNote knows that that's the destination for those search results that you want to capture those references in. Before I proceed, I'm going to close that new blank library. Again, we just want to keep things focused in this session on one library. I've got my library open. I'm going to go to my Mozilla Firefox browser. You can pretty much use the same browsers that you would have direct exported from in the past. I just prefer Mozilla Firefox for personal reasons, but also if you are a Mac OS user, Mozilla Firefox is really the browser I would recommend direct exporting from on Mac OS to have the most seamless experience. You don't really have that stipulation on Windows. You could use Google Chrome, you can use Internet Explorer, you can use Edge. Because of that sort of the Mac OS aspect or requirement, I guess, or suggestion, I typically use Mozilla Firefox here on Windows as well. I'm going to do a real basic search here for that same topic of sushi here. And, you know, in Web of Science, if you have access to this resource, the default field selection is topic. And we can see that it actually searches several fields at once: title, abstract, author keywords, and keywords plus, all in a single search action. I could perform a little bit more complex search than I did from EndNote of PubMed. I can add a secondary search parameter by pressing Add Row. From this screen, I've got a second parameter field. I can choose whatever field I want for this second parameter. I want a particular date range, references published within a particular date range. So I'm going to choose year published. Because I'm looking to narrow the scope of my results, I will leave the AND Boolean operator selected, because that will, narrow the scope of my results as the search is being performed. And I just want all references that pertaining to the topic of sushi published in the last decade. So I'm just going to define the date range 2010 to 2020. Now that I've got my search crafted, I can press search. Pretty much right away, Web of Science will come back to let me know how many references were found. For this particular search, we have 675 results. From Web of Science, I could direct export up to 500 references at a time. If you just wanted specific references, maybe you don't want a range of references, instead you could mark specific results, and only those items would be sent to your EndNote library. But if you don't mark any, you can request a range up to 500. I don't want 500. I think I'll stick with 50 perhaps today. So with nothing marked, I'll go ahead and press export. And you've got quite a few destination options from Web of Science. First option here is EndNote Desktop. That's what we're focusing on today, so go ahead and choose that. And because I hadn't marked any search results, I can define a range of references up to 500. Now, I did just want to point out that this search I crafted had 675 results. This 500 reference limit doesn't mean that I couldn't get the additional 175 references. It just means that after exporting the first 500, I might have to come here and define, even though there are only 675, I could define, a full second range of 500, and again, that would just capture the remaining 175. But today, for this example, I just want the first 50, so I'm going to define that here. Now, because I searched in the Web of Science core collection, I've got a couple of additional record content options. I'm going to choose full record today because that's going to give me the author, title, source, and abstract, but it will also include the author's address for each one of the references and the keywords. So I'm going to end up with a little bit more of a fleshed out reference in my library. Now that I've got this window configured, I can press export. And one of the reasons why we suggest using Firefox for direct exporting is that this browser has built-in file type associations. So instead of having to rely on Windows or Mac OS to know how one of these temporary text files containing the exported references would need to be handled, right here in Mozilla Firefox, you can tell it how you would handle this file. You would always want to make sure that one of these temporary direct export files was opened with the EndNote application. We see that that's already configured here for me, but if it wasn't, I might have to choose other. I might have to navigate to it, from this list here. EndNote's already selected. I'm going to leave it as is. And if you were utilizing Firefox and configuring a direct export like this, I would recommend checking this box that you wouldn't have to configure this window each and every time. But because I lead classes like this fairly often, I'm going to leave this unchecked myself. But again, if you were configuring Firefox, I would recommend marking that the browser remember to do this automatically for files like this from now on. I'm going to go ahead and proceed just by clicking OK. And because I had one library open and it knows exactly where these references should end up, I've got a new temporary group in my library here called imported references. This is just a quick way to confirm that the references that were just captured came in correctly. They're also considered unfiled because, again, they're not yet part of a custom group. Unfiled initially is looking to see whether a reference is in a custom group or not. If you right-click unfiled at any point, this is something even you could do in X9 and earlier, but if you want unfiled to also check whether or not a reference is in a smart group, you've got the option when you right-click on unfiled to include smart groups. I'm going to leave that turned off. I want it just to focus on custom groups. That's the default behavior. So before I move on, this isn't a requirement, but again, because I like to treat my library's unfiled group as its inbox, I like to file these references away right away so that make it a lot easier to group my references. So I just need to make my reference list panel active by clicking any one of these items. I can now perform a select all. I'm going to go and do Control A on my keyboard. And once I'm ready, again, I could go to the groups drop down and go to add references to. This time I'm going to just perform a drag and drop. So I'm just going to go ahead and, if I just drag over Sushi in general, let go. Perfect. We see I no longer have any unfiled references. They're all of these items I've captured in my custom group that's serving as a catch-all. Without doing anything else, we see that EndNote already performed my smart group search. It found that 4 of those 50 references I just brought in contain the phrase sushi domain, and those are part of the smart group. And because I've filed those 50 references away under sushi in general, my not sushi domains combination group has grown as well because there are additional items to consider. So again, just sort of a quick way to sort of manage a project like this. The purpose for these groups, you don't have to apply to each of your projects, but again, this is just a great example of each one of these types of groups that you can utilize. Now, there's another sort of automated method of reference capturing that's been integrated in EndNote Desktop. It's a new feature called EndNote Click. It's utilizing another Clarivate solution that's been previously known as Copernio. Now, the EndNote Click rebrand hasn't taken place yet. Again, we're still pre-launch before EndNote 20. The rebrand should be complete, upon the launch of EndNote, which, as of right now, as long as everything looks good and we get the sign-off from our developers, the release date for EndNote 20 is scheduled for October 27th. There's a chance that could change, so it's not set in stone until we get the sign-off from our development team. But I wanted to mention that at least right now, the planned release date for EndNote 20 is next Tuesday, October 27th. But I wanted to show the sort of EndNote Click / Copernio functionality in action. So this is something just to sort of show you from a browser. The EndNote Click or Copernio, it's a browser plugin. It's something that's going to get installed automatically with the EndNote 20 application. If for some reason that didn't get installed as part of the default installation, it's something that you can install at any point from EndNote 20 from the tools dropdown. I'm going to go to my browser. Again, the rebrand's not done just yet. So for now, I'm actually going to go to the previous site. Really, the functionality is going to be the same. It's just really a rebrand that's taking place. And again, further integration in EndNote 20. This had been sort of an optional companion utility that you could download by itself and still use with EndNote X9. But again, we're further integrating this in EndNote 20. But for now, from a browser, I've gone to Copernio.com. If I didn't have the plugin for my browser just yet, I could install it here. We see I'm in Mozilla Firefox, so it's suggesting that I add it to Firefox. You can load this in, Firefox or a Chromium-based browser. So that means Google Chrome or other browsers that use the sort of Chromium engine. That's sort of the underlying engine that Google uses for the Google Chrome browser, but other developers can create other browsers that function from that same engine, but maybe have different functionality. I've already got this installed. It's a little tab, a little icon that we would see at the top right of the browser itself. This would be really the same if you were in Google Chrome. And I'm going to go and click on my little Copernio plugin shortcut here, and I could perform a search directly from this drop-down interface. I could search PubMed. I can actually change the default search here. If I click the gear icon, I can change some elements of my Copernio plugin or my EndNote plugin once the redesign rebranding is complete. But I'm going to go directly to my locker because I've already gathered some search results, some full text articles here in my Copernia locker. This is sort of a, whether it be called EndNote Click or Copernia locker, this is sort of a storage space or a holding place for the PDFs that you come across through your discovery. And you can view these PDFs directly from your EndNote Click locker or your Copernia locker and read them here if you'd like. But one of the benefits that we have here, or really two benefits actually, is that from your locker, you could send references directly to your EndNote Online account if you prefer. Maybe you've got someone who's just an EndNote Online user, they can still utilize this feature and push items that are just to their EndNote Online account, or they could export references directly to EndNote Desktop. That's what I'm going to do today. I want to capture this reference in my desktop library, and this single action is going to add a new reference in my library and attach the PDF at the same time. Something that had been two separate workflows in the past, we've got merged together in a single action. So again, if this is an item I want to send to my library, I can click Export Reference. What happens is I get, from the locker, I get a temporary text file containing my reference information that I want to bring into EndNote. Again, I just need to make sure that my browser is set to open this file with EndNote. That's already configured. If it wasn't, I would just need to select EndNote from the drop-down. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. All right, and so what we see, perfect, it's finished here. We see a new item in my EndNote library. It's my imported references group has refreshed to show just the one item that came from my locker. All of the previous 50 items are still in my library. Again, this is just a temporary display to help me find what had just been brought in. We see the traditional little paperclip icon signifying that there's a file attachment. I want to quickly touch on file attachments. We haven't talked about that too much just yet. So if I click on this particular reference that came in from my EndNote Click locker or my Copernia locker, we see on the Summary tab the details related to the reference that EndNote created in my library. If I go to the Edit tab, I see all of the underlying metadata that came as part of that export that I just performed. But it's on the Summary tab where we see a shortcut to the PDF. There had been on the tabs panel in older versions of EndNote an attached PDF display. Now that was a really small display. No one could really read the text there, and it was really just using some valuable screen real estate that we could use or better use for displaying more vital information for a reference. And so what we would do here to look at one of these attachments now would be to open this file. So, I do have the option if I would rather not open my PDF with the EndNote PDF previewer, I could click the little drop-down arrow and I could open this PDF with my default PDF editor instead. But if I just click the name of the PDF itself and choose open, that's going to open it with my EndNote PDF viewer. And, we've taken a sort of a more streamlined approach to this PDF viewer. There will be a future EndNote 20 update that adds a sort of a thumbnail view of the pages of the PDF, which can be useful to sort of for navigation purposes. When you're navigating through a particular PDF, that's not going to be present at the launch of EndNote 20, but that will be added for free in a future EndNote 20 update. But from this screen here, it comes up as a 100% view by default. If I wanted to better use my screen real estate before I start reading the article, I could increase this maybe to 200% even, and I can really, without glasses, be able to read this a little bit easier. I can read through the attached PDF, just like I normally would. And then I've also got some annotation functionality that you would have found in older versions of EndNote as well. So hidden behind this little speech bubble icon is the annotation toolbar. If I click on that, we've got the annotation options. I can do things like highlight text if I wanted to. Maybe I'll highlight this entire title. I can strike out text. I can underline text. I can add searchable sticky notes to the pages of the article here. So maybe if I click on the sticky note icon, I can click on the page. I've got a little sticky note annotation. If I double click on that, I've got a field where I can add a sticky note, whether it be, maybe just a little note to myself or a phrase or a keyword. These sticky notes all PDF annotations, including sticky notes, sync between your different computers. If you use EndNote on more than one computer, all of your annotations would sync between those computers. And if you share your library, those changes will show up for all other users that you're sharing the library with. So really adds an extra level of collaboration, being able to share these annotations. I'm going to close my sticky note here, and if I'm done reading this article, whenever I'm done, I can just close this window either by clicking File, Exit, or I could click the little X in the top corner. I'll be prompted to save my change, and I'll go ahead and say yes. Now that I'm back in my library, if I did want to search for my sticky note text, maybe I've got a whole bunch of sticky notes at one point. I wasn't sure which article it was that I wanted to or find, where I would find that particular text. I can toggle on my library window. We have what's called the simple search. Actually, this is something I hadn't touched on earlier. In previous versions of EndNote, there was a quick search field on your library toolbar, and this functions very similarly. The simple search field, it's sort of a global search. You don't choose a particular field. This is going to, when you input something into simple search, it's going to search every single field in each one of your EndNote libraries for that term or that phrase. But if I want to search for my sticky note text, I would toggle away from this simple search by pressing advanced search. That's where we get the more traditional search panel that you might have seen in previous versions of EndNote. And here, again, I can choose a particular field in my EndNote library that I wanted to search. For sticky notes, I would either select PDF notes, or I would choose any field plus PDF with notes. If I choose this, it would actually be searching all fields in my library references. It would search the text of the PDF and the notes within the PDF. So this is really the most global search that you can perform in EndNote. But again, if it was just the sticky note I wanted to query, I could, choose PDF notes, and that was the phrase I had inserted, and I only got the one reference showing, but we see that one reference was found essentially through the search. So that's an excellent way to be able to find, sticky note text. But just like previous versions of EndNote, you could have up to 45 attachments per EndNote library record. If you wanted to just link a file from your hard drive manually, you can press Attach File from the summary panel here. You get a browse window. Most users are attaching PDFs, but you do have the ability to attach really any type of file. So if I wanted to attach, let's say, let's see, do I have an Excel spreadsheet here? No, I'll go ahead and attach a Word document just as an example. I'll choose that, press open. We see that linked now to my reference. And I did just want to point out, just like previous versions of EndNote, if it's a non-PDF attachment, you do need that application installed on your computer to look at that attachment. So if I was on a computer and that didn't have Microsoft Word installed, I would be able to see, the attachment item in the library. It's just I wouldn't be able to open the document without having Microsoft Word installed. But for PDFs, those can be previewed in EndNote and annotated directly in EndNote. So that's a big point that I wanted to make. So we're just moving on here. The last sort of element that I wanted to talk about in terms of adding references to your library is how you would manually add a reference. Really the same workflow as you would have encountered in previous versions of EndNote, and not really something many users have to utilize. But there are certain types of references that you might not be able to find online or digitally in an online database, or perhaps you are able to find the reference online, but maybe the site just doesn't have an EndNote export option. Sometimes a government report or a government document, that site might not have an EndNote export option. So at any point, if you need to manually add a reference, you can go to the References drop-down menu in EndNote. You can choose New Reference. You do, for the New Reference interface, you do get a standalone window just like you would have in previous versions of EndNote. It's really only the Edit Reference interface that's been refocused to the Edit tab right on the library window itself. When you're manually adding a reference, the first thing I would recommend doing is setting your reference type, because you'll notice that there are different field labels for the various reference types. The default reference type is journal article, but let's say I wanted to input a newspaper article instead. Take note of these field labels that we see here. If you just keep your eye on those, if I choose newspaper article, you'll see that some of those field labels change. So for instance, the author field for a journal article is now relabeled to be the reporter field, a little bit more appropriate for this type of reference. The journal field is now called newspaper, again, a little bit more appropriate for the type of details I would be storing. When you're entering, author name information, any naming convention would be fine, whether it be first name, space, last name, or last name, comma, first name. EndNote would be able to recognize either of the two formats. And you want to make sure that each author is on its own line in the author field. That's how EndNote tells where one name ends and the next name begins. These names are in red because this is the first time these names appear in this particular library. So I just wanted to point out, red doesn't mean wrong. It's letting you know, EndNote's letting you know that this is the first time these names appear in the library. Might be a clue to yourself if you know that one of these names did exist in another reference, that maybe you have a typo or maybe you're using a different naming convention, which if you do that can throw off EndNote's ability to consistently output author names. So again, I just wanted to point that out. You don't have to fill in every single field here. You can always come back and input additional details later. I would recommend at least populating the fields that you would want to include in a formatted bibliography. This is enough for an example here. Whenever I'm ready to save my changes, I could go ahead and press save here on the top right. And if I'm finished, editing this reference, I can then close this window. I'm back on my library display. We see my new reference is considered unfiled. I'm going to leave these unfiled for now, but if I wanted to, I could drag these. Actually, I'll go ahead and drag these into one of my custom groups here, just to keep things organized. All right, so that was really the main focus in terms of adding references to the library. I want to talk a little bit about performing a duplicate search. There was an enhancement to that duplicate search functionality in EndNote 20. I wanted to point out that change. We're going to talk about syncing and sharing a library. Really, a lot of the functions for that are very similar in EndNote 20, just some of the commands are repositioned. We'll look at a change to the global edit workflow. If you wanted to globally edit multiple references, there's a slight change in that workflow if you wanted to only impact or affect a subset of your references. We'll close out with a site while you write overview. Not too much has changed in terms of site while you write. Of course, the tab has been refreshed in Word. Just checking the time, I see we have about 15 minutes left in the designated time slot. I have a feeling we'll probably go over time about 15 minutes or so. I've seen a lot of great questions come in. I want to make sure we get those questions answered. So I will try to call out when we're at half past the hour, just in case you do need to drop. But again, if you can stick around, please feel free to do so. If you do have to drop, I will be sending out the class recording or the webinar recording so that you can review the rest of the course at your convenience with that link. But so I wanted to, again, sort of before we sync the library and share it with colleagues, I want to check for duplicates just to make sure that things are nice and organized and streamlined before I start, again, syncing between computers or sharing this library with anyone else. So, in EndNote Desktop, one of the power features that you have available that isn't present in EndNote Online is that you can perform a subset duplicate search. If I just wanted to pick a particular group and check it only for duplicates, I could do that by starting my Find Duplicates process with that group selected. But if I did want to check the entire library for duplicates, I would just start the Find Duplicates process with all references selected. Now, by default, EndNote, when it's checking for duplicate references, EndNote's comparing the author field, year field, title field, and reference type when determining duplicates. Now, in EndNote Online, you can't reconfigure these comparison fields. EndNote Desktop, that's one of the other power features that you have available to you. Before we actually do the duplicate search, I want to show you those comparison fields in EndNote's preferences. So if you go to the Edit dropdown, here in EndNote, we've got the Preferences screen. On Preferences, we would want to go to the Duplicates tab. And again, we've got the default comparison fields, author, year, title, and reference type. You've got, not every field is comparable, but you've got two additional fields to compare in EndNote 20 that are definitely beneficial, especially if you're working on systematic review. And that's the ability to compare duplicates by DOI, and by the PMCID information, the PubMed Central ID. There's two option comparison fields that you can enable if you'd like in EndNote 20. Typically, I'd say, perhaps if you're not working through a systematic review, author, year, title, and reference type is usually precise enough not to end up with false positives, EndNote thinking something's a duplicate when it's not. But if you have, some ambiguous references, maybe you've got a series of book chapters, perhaps, that you're citing, the default options, author, year, and title, those might be identical, and it's the chapter title that's different. So in a scenario like that, you might end up with some false positives, and that might be a scenario where you want to come here and maybe add secondary title or another bit of information just to help EndNote spot what is truly a duplicate and stop reporting items that aren't truly duplicates. I'm not going to change anything here. I just wanted to point out these new enhancements that were added to EndNote 20. I'm just going to press OK. Again, I'm on all references, which means EndNote is going to check my entire library for duplicates. I'm going to go to the References drop-down menu. This is one of the changes that have been made, again, to focus the library-specific commands in EndNote 20 under the library drop-down. This had been under References, but now in EndNote 20, Find Duplicates is on the library drop-down. We see it's right near the top, fourth item from the top. If I click on this, again, EndNote is comparing author, year, title, and reference type. When EndNote finds the first duplicate, I get a side-by-side comparison window. This window looks very similar to, or functions very similarly to how it did in the X9. The design has been updated to sort of match the redesigned library window. And we see that any fields that differ, we see the original reference on the left, the duplicate reference on the right. Any fields in which their information differs between the two, those will be highlighted to help you pinpoint the differences between the two references. Let's say for this initial duplicate, I want to keep the original reference, discard the duplicate. In that case, I can click on the left Keep This Record button. That'll keep the original, send the duplicate to the trash. EndNote will proceed. It comes across another duplicate. I get another side-by-side comparison window. In this particular instance, if I just scroll through here, it looks like they're very similar, but let's say maybe the duplicate actually had a file attachment where the original didn't. That might be an instance where I would want to keep the duplicate instead to make sure that I'm retaining that file attachment. So in that case, I might click on the on the right Keep This Record button to keep the duplicate and discard the original in this case. I can also, on this window, got another duplicate. Let's say both references have unique information, and I want to make sure that I'm saving one complete reference in my library. Let's say, maybe my duplicate had, a couple of additional bits of information here. I can actually copy and paste text from one side to the other. So let's say, again, my duplicate had some additional info, but I wanted to keep the original. I can highlight something on one side. I can just copy it, move over to the other reference that I plan on keeping. I can paste the details, make sure I have one complete reference. Once I'm ready, I could click on the Keep This Record button for that item. And I can continue on and on, going reference by reference, but let's say maybe you've got quite a few duplicates. Maybe you've never performed a duplicate search and you'd prefer just not to go reference by reference, or maybe you know that all of your duplicates are truly identical and you just want EndNote to keep the original reference and mark the more recently entered reference as the one to remove. You can actually click Cancel to, and this is sort of, again, can be confusing to new EndNote users. Some users might think, and I wouldn't blame them, that cancel would stop the duplicate search, but that will actually just bypass the side-by-side comparison process. So again, if I just want EndNote to automatically mark the more recently entered version of each reference as the one to remove, since it would be considered the duplicate, I can actually click Cancel. EndNote's going to show me a duplicate references group. It's sort of a striped display because this group is showing me not only the duplicates highlighted, but it's showing the original references unhighlighted just for visual comparison purposes. Again, not really many times that EndNote will be catching, what I'd say false positives, which aren't truly duplicates, but I always recommend visually scanning your duplicate references group. Make sure that everything's configured as you would like in terms of removal. There might be an instance, let's say for this first reference from Dr. Pepperberg, let's say that the duplicate had a little paperclip here indicating that it had an attachment and the original didn't. If I wanted to keep the duplicate with the attachment, at this point I can hold down Control as I click on the duplicate. It becomes deselected. If I then hold down Control and click on the original reference, it is now selected. So basically in that scenario, I've swapped which reference EndNote is going to send to the trash. Again, might not be something you're looking to do, but if you want to, again, swap or change which reference EndNote will be discarding, you can control-click on a reference to toggle its selection state. Whenever I'm ready, I could send the duplicates to the trash. A couple ways you can do this, but I'm going to go and just right-click over my reference list panel. I've got a contextual menu here where I've got Move References to Trash as one of the options. I'm going to click on that. All right, so my duplicates are now in the trash. I did just want to point out, again, this might be something that would throw off a new user who might not have invested some time in a class like this. But after sending the duplicates to the trash, we see that we still have a duplicate references group, and it still contains some items. I might, again, in my days of EndNote product support, get a question, why are there still items and duplicate references? These are the original references that were displayed for visual comparison purposes. So you wouldn't want to have trashed those, otherwise you would have deleted both the original and the duplicates. When you close and reopen the library, this temporary heading, duplicate references, disappears, and all of the original items will still be part of all references. All of the duplicates will still be in the trash. So that's not something you would have to do, but if seeing the remaining items in duplicate references was causing any confusion, feel free to close and reopen your library, and that would discard or remove this temporary duplicate references heading. Again, just if that was causing any confusion. So at this point, I'm ready to sync this library so that if I have EndNote 20 installed on another computer, I can access these same references there. You know, like I'd mentioned, it is your personal preference whether you want to work with a single EndNote library or if you'd rather develop separate libraries for your different projects. But if you take that approach, if you work with separate libraries and you want to sync your library and possibly share it with other EndNote users, you would have to pick one of your libraries that was going to serve as your designated sync library, and that would also be the library used for library sharing. So again, I typically recommend the approach of storing everything in a single library, and then that way, again, it just that would be the library that you're syncing and sharing. So I've got the sample library open right now. This is perfectly fine for an example of EndNote sync in action. I could initiate a sync command here in EndNote by going to the library dropdown. I did want to point out this used to be on the tools menu, the sync command, but it's now on the library dropdown. I can initiate it from here, or I could click on the configure sync shortcut, and I would have the option to configure sync from here if I wanted to. But I'm going to go ahead and just go back to all references. I'm going to go to the library dropdown. I'm going to choose sync. This sync feature is built into EndNote Desktop, no additional charge for this. You do have to have a free EndNote Online account, and when you link your EndNote Desktop license to your EndNote Online account, you get a sort of a further enhancement in EndNote Online where you've essentially got almost unlimited storage space in the online interface, where if someone doesn't have a desktop license and they're just using what we call a free EndNote Basic account in EndNote Online, they would be limited to 50,000 references and up to 2 gigabytes worth of file attachments. But by linking your desktop license to EndNote Online, you won't have those limits in place. If you did not yet have an account, you can create one for free by clicking sign up. Of course, I've already got an account, so I'm just going to log into that here. All right. And the first time you sync, if I click OK, the first time you sync, EndNote does suggest that you make a backup of your library just in case. And, Murphy's Law, they say if you make a backup, you'll probably never need it. It's when you don't have a backup that something always seems to go wrong. And again, from my days in product support, not just, EndNote, but just support in general, that really does seem to hold true. This is just a test library, so I'm not going to make a backup at this point. But if you did want to make a compressed backup, you can go ahead and say yes here. I'm going to go ahead and say no. Again, this is just a test library due to time constraints for this session here. So I'm going to go and say no. And sync is still a two-way street. Anything that's unique in your desktop library will be sent up to EndNote Online. Anything that might already exist in your online library that's unique would come down to your desktop library. The sync status, or rather the sync progress bar, is now behind sync status. So instead of opening up a separate window which sync status used to do, if you click on it, you'll see the sync status details right on this interface here. You could copy and paste this to an email if you did need to share these details with EndNote product support, but we see the sync progress bar is actually here at the top of the sync status display now. That used to be something that would appear directly on your library toolbar, or if you're on Mac OS, or in the bottom right of your library window on Windows. But again, this is now behind sync status here. So I'm just letting this sync finish. It should wrap up pretty quickly here. We've just got, looks like it just finished there. Perfect. So, we had about 400, how many? 405 references, a couple of file attachments that got sent to EndNote Online. Just like previous versions of EndNote, once every 15 minutes, if you leave the default setting turned on, EndNote would check to see if it needs to send or receive any new library information. Once I've synced on one computer, if I did install my EndNote license on a second or third computer and I wanted to access my synced library there, I would actually start by making a new blank library on the second or third computer, and then the first sync action that takes place, EndNote would copy all of the library information down to that new library on the second or third computer. And then going forward, once every 15 minutes, EndNote would look to see if it needed to send or receive any library information. If you didn't want to wait that 15 minutes, you could go to sync status and you could press sync now at any point, and that would preempt the auto sync, and it would manually check for changes. That might be something you might want to do if you're using library sharing and you want to see changes in a more real-time fashion. Instead of waiting every 15 minutes, you might initiate the sync yourself. Once you've synced your library, if you did want to share the library, you can, just like in EndNote X9, you can pick up to 100 other EndNote desktop users that you want to share your library with. So if that was something you wanted to do, once you've synced your library, you can go to File. You've got the option to share the library. I'm going to click on that. On this screen here, we see I've already got 2 sharees. They've already accepted my invitation. That's why they're showing as a member. For each sharee, I can have a varying level of access rights. So if I wanted to give one person read and write access so that they can make changes to the library, I can do that. If I have someone who just needs to search and possibly cite from the library, I can give them read-only access so that they can just, again, be able to search and possibly cite from the library. I'm going to give my colleague Rick access to my library, so I'm just going to send him an invitation email by defining his email address here in the middle of this window. Like I mentioned, I can change the access rights. The default permission is read and write, but I could restrict this to read only. If in this case, if Rick didn't need to make changes, he just needed access to the library, that would be perfectly fine. Again, an invitation email gets generated, and if I did want to include a personalized note, I can add that here in the message field. Even if you don't add a note, it's very clear what the purpose of the email is and where it's coming from. Excuse me. So you don't have to add a note, but you do have the option if you want. Once you're ready, you can invite someone. They'll show up as pending under status until they've accepted the invitation. At any point, I can click the gear icon next to one of my sharees entries on this window. Even if someone had accepted my invitation, if they no longer need access to the library, I could remove them at any point. I can, if I invited someone and they missed the invitation email, I can remind them. If I click remind, that would just generate a new sharing invitation email. Hopefully that would come through to their inbox. And I can also change access rights. Even after someone has accepted my invitation, I can modify their access rights. This will also generate an alert email for that person. So if they had read and write access and you revert them to read-only, that they would be aware the next time that they open the library why they're not at that point able to make changes to the library. I'm going to go ahead, this is what it looks like as the sharer, but I want to go ahead and show you what it looks like as a library sharee. Not much has changed in that regard, but I'm going to go ahead and press close here. I'm a sharee on a particular library already, and if I wanted to access that, I can go to the File menu here in EndNote. I can choose Open Shared Library, same workflow in X9 and earlier. And like I had mentioned, when you're a sharer, you have to pick and choose one particular library that you're syncing and sharing. As a sharee, you could be part of multiple teams, sharing teams at the same time. So let's say you were working on 5 different projects with 5 different teams. There's a chance that when you came to Open Shared Library, you'd have 5 different email addresses, one for each sharer of each library. I'm a sharee just on one library. That's why I just have the one address listed here. I'll highlight that, press open. And again, this is a second library, which means a second program window has opened. Again, really helps me. They've always been separate containers, but having the separate program tabs helps to reinforce the fact and helps me work between the different libraries if I wanted to. So this is the shared library that's currently up. I've been given read and write access to this library, which means that I can do almost everything that the sharer can do, except as a read and write sharee, I can't modify the team's sharing list. I can't invite or remove someone from the sharing team. I can't make a functional backup of the shared library. That's something only the sharer should do. And I can't change the name of the shared library. It's always going to show up for me as the sharee with the sharer's email address. So I wanted to point that out. But because I've got read and write access, I can look at the references here in the library. I can go to the edit tab for any one of them. I can make changes to the underlying metadata. I can add PDF attachments. I can view my colleagues' annotations. If I wanted to open one of the file attachments, I can see someone else's annotations that have been made, make my own annotations that would sync to everyone else. So I just wanted to point that out. And there's an element of a shared library called the activity feed that now is also behind sync status. There used to be, again, a library toolbar running across the top of the library window that we've in terms of our modern approach to the library interface, we've sort of did away with that, and we've tried to compartmentalize those shortcuts. So now if you want to look at your activity feed on a shared library, you would go to sync status and you would click the little down arrow next to the bell, which represents the activity feed. On the activity feed, you can see 500 of the most recent changes made to the team shared library. You would see, for me, you're seeing some sort of generic labels, and that's because I record a lot of training videos, and it's just a little bit more conducive to have these sort of generic labels. But for a real-world user, each entry here would typically have a person's name so that you would be able to tell who made a change, a little timestamp of when the change was made. The bolded items here are clickable. So like if I was curious, my colleague Dan had added 9 attachments to this library. If I wanted to see the references that Dan changed through that action, I can click on that item, and EndNote shows me those references that were part of that particular change made to the library. So, you know, there's the one thing you can't do from activity feed is you can't undo a change. So if someone makes an unintended change, there's a chance that that could propagate through everyone else's instance of the shared library, in which case you would either need to restore from a backup to replace something that someone might have deleted by mistake, or you might have to recreate, an element that got deleted by mistake. So even if you're not syncing and sharing, it is important to periodically back up your library. That's something that you can do from EndNote, from the file dropdown. You can either use a compressed library here on the file dropdown to make a compressed backup, or you can use save a copy. Either of these would make a sort of a snapshot backup of your library just in case. And something I would recommend doing either on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And if you're sharing your library, I would, you might go for that daily approach perhaps, because that would just save you from, if someone did make an unintended change, again, maybe save you from having to redo any work by being able to restore something from a backup. Now, again, I want to give a quick overview of SiteWhile. Not much has changed there, but in terms of global edit capability in EndNote, you've got really similar functionality. You've got a standard find and replace that used to be on the edit drop-down menu. We see it's here on the library drop-down menu. This is something that you would use if you want, if like maybe you found a typo in a word and you wanted to impact multiple references at once, you could do so here with find and replace. We've got the same functionality that used to be on the tools menu called change, move, copy fields. This is something you can use if you wanted to maybe add a keyword to the end of the keywords field in multiple references at once. You could do that with change fields. You can also clear a field or change the case of the text in a particular field from the screen. You've also got the ability to move data from one field to another or copy data from one field to another. Now, the big difference in terms of workflow is that in previous versions of EndNote, if I wanted to just impact certain references for this global edit, I would select them here, and I would choose an option called Show Selected References. We've done away with that. That seemed to cause more trouble than than benefit for users. So, instead of choosing Show Selected References when you want to perform a global edit on just a subset of references, I would recommend making a group for this function. So you might already have a group where you would be performing one of these edits, in which case you would just start the global edit process by clicking on that particular group, and then if you were to either use find and replace or change move copy fields, the change would only impact these particular references. If you didn't have a group for these particular references, let me just select a handful, you could make one quickly. If you go to the groups drop-down, you can say add references to, create custom group. You can give it any name you'd like. You can leave it with a default group, or you could, if you want to make sure that it's clear for everyone, you can call it something like global edit, just something along those lines. But once you've got the references displayed that you want to customize, you can then come to the library drop-down menu. Again, you can change something via the find and replace. Like I was mentioning, under all references, I've got a couple of entries from a Dr. Irene Pepperberg, and you can see here that this sample library has a couple of different naming conventions for this person, and if I wanted to uniformly enter Dr. Pepperberg's name, this might be an instance where I perform a global edit via find and replace. Or if I wanted to copy data from one field to another, that would be when I use change move copy field. So let's say for these, let's say for my items in the melatonin group here, let's say I wanted to move the information from the label field here, perhaps to one of my custom fields. Because I'm showing the references I want to manipulate, I can now go to library, change move copy fields. In this instance, if I want to move my label details to a different field, I would go to move/copy fields. I want to move the data. I'll leave that radio button selected. And then from the from dropdown, I would choose label. On 2, I can choose whatever destination I want. Maybe we'll, just as a test, put this in custom 5. I believe this is an empty field, so the position of the data shouldn't matter here. If I wasn't certain, if I wanted to make sure it was a custom field and I want to wipe out any information before I do the transfer of the data, I might choose the option to replace entire field. If I press OK, I get a confirmation window that says, in this library, within these so many references, are you sure you want to replace, in this case, custom 5 with the label field? This can't be undone. It's always recommended that you make a backup of your library before performing a global edit, just in case you make an unintended change. This is a test library, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. We see right away EndNote tells me that change has been made, and we should see in just a moment these numbers disappear because they've been moved to another field. So if I click OK, there it is. They've been moved, and if I click on one of these entries, I can go to the Edit tab, and if I scroll down, we would see in custom 5, or actually I'm not sure if I'm showing, yeah, there it is, custom 5 here. That's where I've moved the data. So really, in general, the global editing functionalities are the same. Their position has moved on the drop-down menus to the library drop-down, and the primary change made to the workflow is that if you want to impact a subset of references, you no longer would be choosing show selected references. I would recommend making a group for this action and then selecting that group before you initiate the global edit. So I wanted to point that out. So with this library open, this is still my shared library. You can cite from a shared library if you'd like, or you can cite from a personal library that exists on your computer. I'm going to leave both open just for now. I've got a real basic Word document open. We see I've got my new EndNote 20 tab. Everything looks very similar in regard to the placement of the commands. Really all that's changed here is we've got an updated icon for the EndNote 20 logo here for the go to EndNote command. A couple of different ways you can add a citation. If I want to stay in Word while I'm inserting a citation, I can position my cursor in the text. I can click the Insert Citation shortcut represented by this little magnifying glass icon. This screen is showing me what's called the Find and Insert My References window. This window is blank initially. Once you've performed at least one search, you would see that last search auto-populate the next time you come to this window. Since this is a fresh install, that's why it's blank. I can input any bit of information from any one of my active libraries on this window. If I press Find, EndNote shows me how many references match the scope of that search. I see that I've got 137 results altogether. Now, because I've got two libraries open, we would see that, this window would show me results from both libraries, and the library label would let me know which particular library one of these results was found in. So you can see some are found in my sample library, some of these are found in my shared library. Just lets me know, make sure I'm citing from the correct library. If I had ambiguous results, I wasn't sure which reference it was I want to insert, I've got a full list of metadata further down on this window where I can see all of the underlying information that can help inform my decision here. If I click the down arrow next to insert, this would be beneficial if I was using an author date citation format. There are instances where you might need to customize the appearance of your author date citation, and so you've got options to either position the author outside of the parenthetical citation, the parenthetical year. You could exclude the author so it's just a parenthetical year. You can exclude the year, or you could suppress the entire citation and just include the reference in the bibliography. I'm using the JAMA style here, so that's really not going to matter because JAMA is a numbered style. I'm just going to press Insert. And instant formatting is turned off in this sample document. That's what we're seeing, a placeholder, what we call a temporary citation. I'm going to turn this on. This is usually turned on by default in a Word document, where after you insert a citation, you would see it become formatted. I've got field shading turned on. That's where we're seeing this gray shading. It's a Word setting, and it's just an element that lets me easily spot items or elements in the document that come from EndNote. EndNote inserts hidden codes behind the elements that it adds. And again, they'll show up as gray shaded because there's field codes in place. So that was how to insert a citation while staying in Word using insert citation. If I'd prefer to switch back to my library to insert a reference, I would just reposition my cursor. Maybe we'll put it right here. I would go back to my library. I could either press Go to EndNote here, or if I've got more than one library open, I could just click the particular library that I want to cite from on my taskbar. Let's go, we'll stick with the theme of the AVEN Intelligence project. I'll go to my parents group here. I can highlight one or more references if I want to make a grouped citation. So if I want to make a group citation, I would hold down Control as I click on a second or third reference. You see they all become highlighted. In terms of insert selected citation from EndNote itself, EndNote 20, I can either go to Tools, point my mouse over Cite while you write. I can choose Insert Selected Citation, or I can memorize the keyboard shortcut of Alt-2. That would initiate this action as well. Alternately, if I'd prefer to just go back to my Word document once I've selected the references, I can click on the label Insert Citation. These are actually two different buttons here. If I click on the label Insert Citation, I get a drop-down where I could also select Insert Selected Citation. I would probably say that the keyboard shortcut is the easiest for this, the Alt-2 would be the easiest, but since I'm on this drop-down, I can just click on Insert Selected Citation. Right when my cursor is flashing, we've got the new grouped citation that I've just created here because it had several references selected. And again, it really comes down to personal preference. Some users like to stay in Word while they're citing, in which case you can use Insert Citation. But if you'd prefer to switch back to your library to select your references there, you would use Insert Selected Citation for that. Now, the style that you choose on the EndNote tab in Word really dictates how your references should appear, but there are some document-specific customizations that you can add to the bibliography that you would only achieve through a command called Configure Bibliography. This little diagonal arrow at the bottom of the EndNote tab, you would see that there's this diagonal arrow would trigger the Configure Bibliography command. And if I click on this, this is sort of a Microsoft design element, but this existed in EndNote X9 and earlier. But if I click on this, I get Configure Bibliography. This is where I can apply some further customizations to my document. If I want to change my style, that's something I could do here right on the EndNote 20 tab. But from here, I can change my style. Maybe we'll format with APA 7th instead. I could make my citations clickable hyperlinks if I was submitting my project in a digital format and my reader would also be viewing the document in a digital format. I can make my citations clickable hyperlinks so that the reader could jump to the reference in the bibliography. The Layout tab is really the heart of the customization options. I can change the font of my bibliography. I can change the size of the text. I can add a bibliography title. And if I highlight that with my mouse, I can go to text format and I can apply a font attribute like bolding just to the title. If I was using a numbered style like JAMA, I could start my bibliography with a number other than 1 if I wanted to. I'm going to be formatting with APA 7. That's an author date style, so this doesn't come into play here. I can influence my first line indent, how large the indent would be for my first line. Hanging indent would be applied to subsequent lines, second, third, fourth lines of a reference, if the style was set to use it, which APA 7th is, so that's going to be 1/2 inch by default. I can change my line spacing. If I want the entire bibliography to be double spaced, I could do that, or I could keep a single spaced reference, and I can increase the readability of my bibliography by adding a single blank line after each reference. Again, that would help increase the readability. Once I've got this configured, if I click OK, all right, we see all my changes take effect. I've got my APA 7th guidelines applied. I've got my formatted in-text citations here. I've got my bibliography, updated font and size. I've got my bibliography title, and I've got my space after between each reference to increase the readability. Pretty much that's the same workflow that you would find in X9 and earlier. The last element that I wanted to touch on, I know we're over time here. I do apologize for running long. This is the first time I've led a session like this for EndNote 20, so it took a little bit longer than I thought. But the last element that I just wanted to touch on today before we start looking at questions is that if you want to customize your in-text citations, same as EndNote X9 and earlier, you wouldn't want to achieve this by just manipulating what you see. You would highlight the citation that you want to customize. You would go to Edit and Manage Citations on the EndNote 20 tab. You get a list of all of the citations in your text. Whichever citation is selected will be in focus automatically. Kind of hard to tell because I just highlighted the first citation. Of course, the first item on the list is highlighted. But even if this was the 100th citation in the text, it would come up in focus automatically. The bottom half of this window is really the power features for the citation customization options. I've got the formatting drop-down where I can do things like exclude the author if I want to. Maybe I'll go ahead and suppress Dr. Pepperberg's name as if maybe I mentioned her name in the preceding sentence. That's a scenario in which you might be requested to suppress the author name so it's not duplicated. I can add a plain text prefix to the beginning of the parenthetical citation. Suffix is the same concept, just at the end of the parenthetical citation. And certain styles set up to use cited page information like APA 6th and APA 7th would allow you to type in a page number or a page range in the pages field. Again, to sort of let your reader know where in that source work to find the concept or the information that you're referencing or you're including in the body of your text. Once I'm ready, I can click OK. All right, we see all of those changes take effect, and those changes can be made on a citation by citation basis, which is really helpful, especially if you are including cited page information, because each of your citations might refer to a different page in that source work. So that was a quick overview of Cite While You Write. Again, really the same workflows, even though we've got a refreshed modern interface in EndNote 20 itself, we've got a similar approach to Cite While You Write in Microsoft Word. So new user or returning users, I guess, would be more suitable, wouldn't be confused about the functions in here, really the same functions. Now, the last two items that I wanted to mention, I actually mentioned one of them already, but a couple of menu items have been changed in terms of their name. On the File drop-down menu, this used to be called Compressed Library, sort of past tense. This has been changed to present tense. It's called Compressed Library. Really the same function, just a difference in the label. The command for copy reference, it was called copy formatted. That is now called copy formatted reference, like I mentioned. Let me just pull it up here just to find that. Here it is. So again, this used to be on the edit dropdown. It's now on the references dropdown. This command used to be called copy formatted. To make it a little bit clearer what its purpose is, we've now called it copy formatted reference. Same underlying function. You would copy a reference, paste it in Word or an email, something like that. And something that used to be called record summary, if you wanted to get information about a particular entry in your library, that's now called reference summary. That's also found on the references dropdown at the bottom here, called reference summary. This window gives you some information if you have Web of Science and the selected references indexed in the Web of Science, you would get some time-cited information. This is dynamic. You would get a label that lets you know when the reference was added, the last time it was updated, how many fields are in use, and which custom and smart groups this particular entry is associated with. So just same function, same underlying function, just a different label here. And with that, we're at the end of the prepared lesson, and I wanted to thank everyone for sticking around with me if you're able to, and I did want to address the chat questions at this point. So if you have any lingering questions that you haven't submitted yet, feel free to do so. And again, I'm going to go through these questions just to make sure we get everything answered here. So I'm going to go and scroll up. I see a lot of great questions, and I just want to make sure that that I'm addressing each question here. So again, if you have a question, even if it's not something directly pertaining to something that we've touched on today, feel free to put it in the chat. So first question that came in, someone asked, can one change to a bottom display, or is it only the right-hand display now? So that's something that I mentioned in terms of the tabs panel. We've sort of did away with the bottom display. It's only on the right. I would say the best use of a widescreen monitor's screen real estate is having it on the right side of the window. So I do apologize if you did prefer having it at the bottom, but it's just being able to display this information in such a way, in this orientation instead of spread out horizontally at the bottom of the library window made a little bit more sense having it over here. You can hide this at any point if you prefer. You can click the X. Again, you give yourself a little bit more screen real estate for your reference list panel if you prefer, but at any point if you want to show that again, you can double click on any entry. You're taken back to that tabs panel, and again, you can get to either tab or the attached PDF from here. Okay, got another question. Let's see. Someone had asked about in terms of if we have a style, rather if you can't find a predefined style in EndNote, they just wanted to confirm that you can work with EndNote product support to help modify an existing style to get it to match your required formatting guidelines. Yes, that's the case. Really, all our support team needs to know is how you want to format your references. As long as you're able to explain that to the support rep, we can help find an existing style that's somewhat close to what you're looking for, which will help us make fewer changes. Fewer changes would be necessary to get it to match your guidelines. But again, you would work with the product support rep. Might have to go through a couple iterations. They might, again, based on your requirements, might make sort of a first attempt or a first approach, provide you with a copy of that style for you to test out, make sure things look good. If further edits need to be made, we'd be happy to help you make those edits and really get those requirements down. But again, we've got just over 7,000 styles available to download at EndNote.com. So just to quickly show you, nothing has changed in this regard. But if you were to, from a web browser, go to EndNote.com, visit our downloads page. This is where you'll find our style repository. This label's outdated. We've just surpassed the 7,000 style threshold, but you can find new styles to download here. Same goes for import filters and connection files. We've got all of our content files available to download from the downloads page at EndNote.com. So I wanted to point that out. Someone mentioned they're sort of disappointed by only having 10 display columns. I do apologize. That it historically has been sort of the limit. I think in the past 10 versions or so, you've got the 10 display columns. The summary tab will show additional information. So, based on what is showing in the summary tab, perhaps you can sort of harmonize the information that's shown for the reference here in the summary tab, and maybe that would influence or help you decide which display columns you would choose. Great suggestion to have more than 10 display columns. I'll be sure to share that with the EndNote product team. But just as of now in EndNote 20, there are up to 10 display columns available to configure in EndNote. Let's take a look here. Someone asked, are references that are only in a smart group still counted as unfiled references? So that was something we touched on as well. Initially, yes, if you've got, in terms of unfiled references, by default, unfiled is only considering items that aren't part of a custom group. But at any point, even in EndNote X9, if you wanted to have unfiled consider smart groups as well, you would just right-click on the unfiled group, and you've got the option to include smart groups. And if you were to do that, EndNote would sort of determine whether or not one of the entries in your library was in a custom group or a smart group. And if it was located in either of the two, it would not be considered unfiled. So again, hope that helps. And again, for any of these questions, if you have a clarifying question that you need to add, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll circle back around to get that in there. Someone said, how do you select different typefaces? So that's one of the different, the streamlined approach to the EndNote 20 is we've got one sort of font that's applied to the interface. You can control how large the font size is from EndNote's Preferences screen. If you go to Edit, Preferences, under the Display Font tab, you have the choice to basically influence how large the font would be. If you think that choosing a font would be important, definitely I'll be sure to submit that suggestion to the product team. But at least for our first approach in terms of getting a really sort of standardized and a scalable display, for very small screens or very large screens, this was the approach that we thought to take. So I don't think there'll be much trouble with this, but again, if you prefer to be able to choose your own fonts, again, I'd be happy to submit that feedback to the product team, and perhaps we'll see a change in a future update to EndNote 20. Let's take a look here. So another question, so does an online search tab just still all search results into one library, no temp holding area? No, so it's only a temporary holding area now. You can perform an online search from your library window. So again, let's say, just as an example, I want to search Library of Congress. I can click here. Now that I've established the connection to this online database, the search panel is now linked to search that particular online database. I can search, maybe we'll search for California just as an example. I can start bringing in references here. Again, this is just a temporary space. None of these are in my library until I choose items that I want to copy from this temporary search space into my EndNote library. EndNote's going to initially display the first 25 search results, up to the first 25. If there are additional search results past that, you'll have a little configuration window where you can display up to 25, 50, 75, or 100, or you've got the upper limit where, let's say, maybe you've got 500 references from the search and you want to display them all in the temporary space, you would be able to do so. And it's only once you've selected the specific references that you wanted to keep when they would actually be part of your library. So I've just stopped the search just to show 14. If I wanted maybe just 3 of these, let's say, I would just mark them here. Once I was ready, I would be able to click the little plus symbol to add the selected online records to my local library. If I click on that, we would see them become part of the library. They're initially unfiled, and I would be able to, from here, add them to a custom group if I wanted to, or anything like that. So just to reiterate, the simplified approach to online search means that there's no integrated search option. Nothing from an online search will be added to your library automatically. Everything appears in a temporary space, even though it's all contained on the same library display. These search results, they're all temporary spaces, and these will reset. If I either close the library and reopen it, or I perform another search, these temporary spaces will refresh just to show me my last set of search results. So hope that helps. I definitely think this is a simpler approach, and it should help to lessen the confusion that a lot of users seem to have with the various search modes in the past. So then we get, in the chat, we're getting to the point where I had forgotten in the Smart group to change my field drop down. So I did want to thank all the Eagle Eye attendees who spotted that, because I might not have spotted that right off the bat. So I appreciate the feedback that I got on the Smart group configuration hiccup. I got another question. Can we copy and paste references between tabs or different groups? Yes, you could do that. Yeah, if you wanted to, these are all part of the same library. So, if I did open, let's say, right now, if I go to all references, that's the tab that I'm on. If I wanted to show my sushi group set, I could go ahead and display that in a separate tab. If I did want to, I could, copy, a particular set of references from one tab to another if I'd like. Again, that may end up if I copied them, it would duplicate the references, because again, these are all from the same library. So if your desire was to actually just associate references from one group to another, let's say, the command that I would use instead would be the Add References To option. Here on the Groups drop-down, you've got Add References To, and you would be able to associate references from one group to another. But if you did have 2 libraries open, like I do here, I've got my shared library and my sample library. If I did even want to copy and paste between libraries, I could select references from one, I can copy them, go back to my other library, and then wherever I want to paste these, maybe I'll just put them unfiled initially, just paste those, and they come over. Very similar to, you know, older versions of EndNote, how that would function, even though we've got the separate tabs here now. So someone asked, when you search multiple words, are they always considered to be a phrase versus individual words? It depends on, you know, how you're searching. You know, if you've got what we call the simple search displayed, if I click here and we've just got the single sort of wildcard global any field search, this would be searching any field. So if let me go to all references here. If I was searching for, let's say, Adams, you know, 1994, these bits of information can be in 2 different fields, and EndNote would find them. But if I was doing an advanced search, you know, you're picking particular fields that you're querying. So if I wanted to perform that same search here, I would say, you know, author contains Adams and year contains 1994 to you know, achieve that same goal essentially. So it really comes down to whether you're using simple search or advanced search. Hope that helps. Someone asked, but in terms of duplicate searching, still no check for duplicates already in library. Yeah, not really, nothing, no enhancement related to automatically checking for duplicates in that regard. Great suggestion. That's something we might see in the future, even for a future EndNote 20 update perhaps. Can't guarantee that, but I'll be sure to pass along that feedback. On a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, I would recommend, you know, checking your library for duplicate references, and you can do that at any point by initiating a find duplicate search. So I hope that helps. Let's see here, just a moment. Okay. So someone asked, let's see, and I'm not sure if I understand someone, oh, I see, someone mentioned the paperclip icon. Yes, the paperclip in an EndNote library just lets you know that a reference has at least one file attachment. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a PDF. It could be a Word document or something else. But once you click on one of the items that has a paperclip, you would be able to tell either from the Edit tab, there's a field called File Attachment where you could look at it there, but right at the top of the Summary tab, you would see a list of all of the attachments. If it's a PDF, you could open it directly in EndNote to annotate it or read it. If it's a Word document or something like that, you would be able to open it from here, but that other type of file would need to open in that example in Microsoft Word for you to read it. There was a follow-up question about the annotations. Can you apply different colors for the highlighting? Do apologize, at least as of now, it's just a yellow highlight for the annotation. If I go back to the annotation toolbar here, let me just return to the annotation. So it's just the yellow, at least for now. Again, great suggestion. Hopefully we could apply something like that in the future. But as of right now, it's just the sort of standard yellow highlighter color that you would be able to apply to highlighted text in your file attachments, your PDF file attachments. I hope that helps. All right, so we're getting closer to the end here. Just a couple more. I want to make sure we answer these questions before we wrap. But again, if you do need to drop, feel free to do so. You know, you can review the rest of the Q&A at your convenience with the recording link. So someone had mentioned if Mac OS is going to have similar changes in feature parity. Yeah, so the Mac version of EndNote 20 is still under development. It's probably going to be released. Again, these dates can change because, you know, development, issues might come up that don't comport to a development plan. So, you know, dates can change, but we're expecting to have the Mac version of EndNote 20 released at the end of November. There might be tiny elements that are different between the two platforms. You know, Microsoft and Apple have sort of different design approaches to their operating systems, and certain elements we try to mirror or match, you know, the design concept or design approach to the operating system. So there might be small elements that are different, but really looking for feature parity. And I expect the library interface to be much more similar between Windows and Mac OS than we have seen in previous versions of EndNote. So I hope that helps. Someone asked, is OCR integrated in EndNote? It would be great for EndNote to extract information from a non-DOI PDF file. Do apologize, the EndNote application itself isn't able to perform, you know, OCR, optical character recognition. That would be something you would need to do, you know, in a PDF editor. And once it's been run through an OCR conversion utility, then programs like EndNote would be able to read the text and make heads or tails of the text on the pages and not just see pictures of each page. So great suggestion. Just as of now, even EndNote 20 doesn't have the OCR capabilities. Someone asked, can you please show the find reference update feature? Yes, I'd be happy to do that. Nothing's really changed in that regard. Oh, let me relaunch EndNote here. It looks like I closed it by mistake. Okay, there we go. So let's say, I'm not sure if I have any references. Let's see, I've got a couple references needing updates here. So let me select one. And once I've got, an item selected in my library, I could select a batch, and then it would go one by one, checking for changes. You have to select at least one reference. But once I've got an item selected, I can go to Find Reference Updates on the References drop-down menu. And EndNote is going to query PubMed, and if I have access to it, Web of Science, to try to find updates for that particular reference or the references I've selected. If an update is found, my reference is shown on the right. So a very similar approach. This window has been refreshed just a little bit to sort of mirror the sort of modern look of the new EndNote 20 library window. Fields that differ are still going to be highlighted, very similar to the Find Duplicate search. So we see that my reference, I'm missing the date, the available update. There's an additional identifier that I would be able to add to the ISSN field. I have the option to update all fields if I'd like, in my EndNote library. But if I was worried about replacing any fields that might contain custom identifiers that I might have added, I could choose Update Empty Fields instead. It's really personal preference. If I had multiple references selected, once I choose one of these actions, EndNote will ask if I want to apply that action to each of the subsequent references so that I don't have to handle them one at a time. I've only got one selected, so when I click on Update All Fields, EndNote lets me know that those pieces of information have been added, and I would be able to come here and see all of the new information that was entered in my particular reference. So hope that helped. Got a couple more questions here. What about capture reference if you need to import a document from a website? Not really, nothing too much has changed for capture reference. We're actually looking to sort of mirror that functionality from capture reference in EndNote Click. That's still to come after the rebrand, but nothing has really changed in terms of capture reference. It's still available to download. That bookmarklet is still available to download from endnote.com. You go to the Downloads tab. We do have it linked here toward the middle. It's something I've already got it, but you can drag it to your either favorites or bookmarks toolbar in your browser. And this is something that can help you jumpstart the addition of a reference in your library. And it does so by sort of scraping the metadata on a particular page to, again, try to auto-populate information to add to your library. The feature can be hit or miss because it really depends on the information, the metadata information that's found. So just as an example, I'm on Google Books, and if I click Capture Reference, we'll see what it's able to scrape here. So just, it's in the process. Okay, perfect. So it actually, it did find some information. Looks like the author information is missing. It's something I can add here, but Capture Reference was able to, grab a couple of bits of information here to jumpstart the addition of a reference. And again, I can fill in any missing information, and I can save this right to EndNote Online, or I could redirect it to EndNote Desktop. So this functionality is still present, and nothing has really changed in terms of Capture Reference for the release of EndNote 20. And ultimately, we're really looking to incorporate the capture reference functionality into EndNote Click, and at some point we'll probably retire the capture reference bookmarklet and have everything just in the EndNote Click browser plugin. So great suggestion, and again, keep your eye out for any changes in that regard. Someone else asked, is it possible to print list of references by selecting multiple groups and group sets? You do have the ability to print from EndNote, but I would really recommend utilizing that copy formatted reference feature and then pasting into either a Word document or a Notepad window and then printing from there. And so again, you do have a print command here on the file drop down, but I would typically recommend if I wanted to print all my parent references, I would just select them all. I would make sure that I've got my desired style selected here on the Tools drop down menu. Maybe we'll use the APA 7th again. Once I've got that style selected, I can go to References, Copy Formatted Reference. Once I was ready, I could then go into Word, and let's just open a new document. If I paste in Word, I now have the ability to, before I print, even manipulate this further if I wanted to. So with this plain text bibliography, if I wanted to use Word to change the line spacing, let's say, I would be able to do that because this is all plain text when you use copy formatted reference. From here, I could then do a print and again utilize the print command in Word itself. But just to recap, technically you do have the print capability in EndNote. I typically recommend, pasting a plain text bibliography elsewhere and then printing from Word or something like that, but really your choice. And nothing else has been sort of changed in that regard for EndNote 20. Someone has a question, will the feature share a group be more seamless? Right now, the one accessing a shared group don't have the same feature as sharing a full library. Sometimes sharing a full library seems a little too much for collaborating on a specific project. Nothing really in that regard has changed. If you share your library, you could have up to 100 library sharees, and the sharees would access your shared library from EndNote Desktop by going to File, Open Shared Library. They would be able to see all of your groups, references, and file attachments. If you want to share one of your custom groups, you can still do that. For instance, this parrots group, if I wanted to share this with someone else with EndNote Online, I've right-clicked on the group. I can go to Share Group. I get a similar sharing interface that I do have with library sharing, where I would define someone's email address that I would want to have access to the shared group. I can give varying levels of access rights. Once I've shared it with the person, they would need to access the shared group via EndNote Online to interact with its contents. You do have a shortcut to your shared groups here in EndNote Desktop. So in EndNote 20, we can see 2 shared groups that have been shared with me. If I click on one of these items, I still need to interact with it from EndNote Online. So you see my EndNote Online interface is coming up. It's taking me right to that shared group. As a group sharee, if I've been given read and write access, I can manipulate the information. I can cite right from the shared group, but there is a limitation that group sharees cannot see file attachments. That's historically been a limitation of group sharing. The same is the case, at least right now, with EndNote 20. This may develop further in the future. I can't really comment on timelines or things like that, but after the release of EndNote 20, we're going to be looking at updating the interface of EndNote Online and updating some of its functionality. So this could be something in the works. I just can't really comment on future development plans because things can change and timelines can change. But great question. Just as of now, group sharing does function really the same way as in X9. Let's see, just checking some of the other questions here. So someone asked in terms of the insert selected citation. There used to be a shortcut on the library toolbar that would trigger insert selected citation. Because we've sort of streamlined the approach to the library window where we don't have that long toolbar across the top, there isn't a shortcut button for insert selected citation. You can, from the tools menu, you can trigger it from the menu item here. Or again, if you just remember Alt-2, if I position my cursor in the Word document and select a reference in my library, I just press Alt-2. Takes me right back to my Word document there. Oops, it actually, I refreshed my browser here, but back in Word, we see that my citation was inserted right where my cursor was flashing. So I do apologize. Great suggestion. I'm not sure if they'll be able to add that back to the interface, but I will pass that feedback along to the product team. But for now, if you just remember Alt-2, that'll trigger the same command or that the shortcut button would have triggered in the past. All right, so just moving down the list, got a lot of great questions here. Again, I just want to make sure these questions get answered because our trainer audience, these questions will probably come up for you as well. And again, these are great questions. Want to make sure that they're all answered. Someone asked something about why is it EndNote 20 current version is X9? Yes, EndNote 20 is not released yet. This is a pre-release preview that I wanted to give to our trainer audience so that you're familiar with the new interface once it's released next week. As of now, slated as of now, and again, sort of get your eyes on it before the new interface is out. Someone asked, can we, actually already answered that question. Someone else asked, will EndNote have sort of integrated support for a Chinese character set? No, the EndNote is Unicode compliant, so if you do have, double byte characters in your references, EndNote will be able to format them in that character set, using a Unicode font. But in terms of the interface itself, at least the initial release is going to be, an English language interface. From EndNote Online, you do have the ability to apply or view the interface in several different languages or character sets, but at least with the initial release of EndNote 20, the interface is, English language oriented. So I do apologize. Great suggestion. I will be sure to pass it on. Someone else asked, what was the definition of save as for a library, or what would the definition of save as for a library be in EndNote 20? The same, save as, it doesn't really apply to references or libraries in EndNote. That would be for content files. Like if I was editing a style and I wanted to save a version with a new name, that's where I would use save as. For a library, it's the same as in an X9. It's called save a copy. This is basically like a save as method that you would, or function that you would see in Word. You're saving a new version of the library, snapshot it as it exists as of now. You're just giving it a new name and saving the data in a new container. So you can save this anywhere. EndNote suggests a pending copy at the end of the name. That's perfectly fine. I can save this to my desktop, and with that, I've now got a copy of the library that I could share with someone else, or would serve as a backup of the library just in case. So great question. All right, let's see here. So just moving down, so the follow-up about the OCR integration, and yeah, I will be sure to pass that along to the product team, just to make sure that that's submitted there. Let's see. The group sharing option, not sure what that has, the context of that question is about. You can share groups. We just sort of covered that. You see the group shared by others shortcut on your groups panel. If you want to interact with a shared group, that's when you would come to the EndNote online interface, and this is, where you would see the contents of a shared group. So if there is some more context to that, please feel free to put a clarifying comment in the chat or clarifying question, and I'll circle back around to that. Someone put a comment or a follow-up about the capture reference bookmarklet not functioning in all browsers. I know in Google Chrome, I think I've seen in Chrome that you're getting this and I see that's what you're referring to. You get this sort of prompt to sign in over and over. I believe that pertains specifically to Google Chrome. I'm not sure what changed in the browser that's causing this underlying issue. It seems to be working here in Firefox. So, I mean, if you do prefer to use capture reference, please try it in Firefox. Let me know if that works. Our developers are aware of that repeated sign-in issue. Not sure, in terms of technically speaking, what is going to change, but ultimately we are looking at mirroring that functionality in the EndNote Click plugin, and possibly at some point retiring the capture reference bookmarklet. But again, do apologize for that issue. But if you want to try capture reference, please give Mozilla Firefox a go and see if it functions any different for you there. Someone else asked, can we password protect specific libraries or groups that we have shared on a shared computer? No, I do apologize. Not way to password protect a library. What I would recommend that on Windows, you've got user-specific folder, so if you were to save a library, let's say here's my user folder. All of these items on my computer are only accessible when I'm logged into the computer. So if I want to save my library in one of these default folders like downloads or documents, that's something only I would be able to access on a shared workstation. I could make an EndNote folder, an EndNote library folder if I wanted to, but anything under my user account, again, these are items that only I should be able to get to when I log into the computer. So hopefully that helps. And let's see, just checking any other questions here. Let's see. And see a little feedback about that cite button for insert selected citation. We'll be sure to pass that along to our developers, and that's something they might be able to restore. But we were really looking to simplify the library interface to lessen the noise, make things a little bit easier and to find. But again, I will pass along that feedback about possibly restoring the shortcut button. But as of now, I would recommend just that Alt-2 keyboard shortcut. And again, just to follow up about the password protecting a library or a group. Great suggestion, just something you can't do as of now, but I'll be sure to pass that along. All of this feedback, I'll be sure to pass along to developers. And with that, we're quite a bit over time. I do apologize. I just wanted to make sure we got all of the questions answered. My lesson plan took a little bit longer than expected, so I do appreciate anyone who's able to stick around. I know schedule constraints, there are some users who might have wanted to, just weren't able to due to conflicting meetings. Got one last question here before I wrap up with a couple of support and training resources. But someone asked, will EndNote 20 license be available for those who have had prior trainer licenses, or do we need to apply for one? I will be for anyone who had requested an X9 trainer copy, you will receive an EndNote 20 trainer copy automatically. They might not be, the trainer certificates might not be sent out immediately at launch. So if EndNote 20 comes out before you get your trainer copy, feel free to install a demo of EndNote 20. It's fully functional for 30 days. I'll definitely make sure that everyone gets their trainer certificates with their EndNote 20 trainer copy automatically. Everyone on the session probably already has an X9 trainer copy. That's the list that we use for the invitation for this session. If you're not sure if you had one or not, feel free to request a trainer copy from the EndNote LibGuide page. But again, anyone who had been received an EndNote X9 trainer copy at a university or a nonprofit or government organization, you'll get an EndNote 20 trainer copy automatically. And then the last thing I just wanted to show before we wrap is that we're developing a new training resource. This is a sort of a visual aid. It's optional. It's not something that you have to use, but it's what we're calling the EndNote 20 slide catalog. And this is basically a PowerPoint presentation where you can, each slide in this presentation focuses on a particular feature in EndNote, and it has an embedded video that shows that feature in action. And you could teach a class completely from the deck if you wanted to, or if you just wanted to draw upon the deck and maybe add some specific features to another presentation that you're developing. The approach that we've taken to this resource is modular. So if you just wanted to copy specific features out, those slides into another deck, feel free to do so. But just to show you quickly, I'm just jumping sort of midstream in the EndNote 20 slide catalog. If I go into slideshow mode, we see that this particular slide touches on direct exporting from classic Web of Science. And once I've sort of mentioned a blurb about that feature or that workflow, I can click on the video here. It plays in full screen on Windows. If you wanted to pause the video as it's playing, you can press Alt-P. That's a PowerPoint shortcut to pause or play a video. Again, if you wanted to add a little bit of context, you can pause it as it's going. The videos are set to loop. So, if you, as to not rush a presenter, you can let the video loop if you're in the middle of explaining something. And again, you can let it run. Once you're ready, you can just click, on the video, jump to the next slide, and again, sort of continue on a class using this resource. So this resource, again, you can use it for a real-world class, or you might use it just for yourself to become familiar with EndNote, ahead of teaching a class of your own. You can just watch these sort of examples in action, and if you want to mimic the steps in the real-world EndNote 20 on your computer, feel free to do so. But this is a new aid that we wanted to develop. We think it's going to be beneficial, and everyone who's registered for this session will receive this one. I'm just putting a couple of finishing touches on this resource before we make it available. You can see that each video includes slide notes that sort of describes the scenario that's shown in the showcase video, and some just general tips that you might want to mention about that particular feature to keep in mind for your users. So again, this is a resource that all trainers that were invited to the session will receive once it's ready. And in addition to that, we're going to have the standard training videos. We're taking a sort of a different approach to a guide creation. Historically, we've had really great guides, but they were very lengthy, and it kind of was a little bit overwhelming for some users in terms of finding content. So we're going to be taking, in terms of our PDF guides, a more targeted approach where specific guides will be focusing on a particular feature or workflow, just to make it a little bit easier to spot or walk through these instruction. And again, trainers will receive all of these resources. They'll be posted on the training portal as well at endnote.com. You can always go to the training portal. That'll take you to the EndNote training portal, where you can find our pre-recorded training videos, a link to our e-learning platform. We will have some EndNote 20 e-learning modules. So if someone might not be able to take one of our live webinars, you could sign up for one of our e-learning modules to work through at your convenience at any time that you'd like. We'll have our digitized text guides available here as well. We've got our live training calendar at how you would find our typical classes or our Q&A sessions. And I did just want to point out, we've already got our November calendar published. So you'll be able to see here on the training calendar, we've got a general What's New in EndNote 20 session that's going to be open to the public, our EndNote 20 Essentials class. We've got a workflow classes as a 30-minute session focusing specifically on that EndNote Click plugin, our weekly Q&A session. So feel free to sign up for these or send your users links to these calendars so that they can sign up for these sessions as well if you'd like. And then, if you or your users have, any issues that you might not be able to wait for one of our weekly Q&A sessions, you can go to endnote.com and click the support tab. That will take you to our support page where you can search our knowledge base, find knowledge articles that have been prepared by our product support team. But if you want to open a ticket with our product support team, we've got a great team of support reps that work around the clock, 24/5, Monday through Friday. They're able to answer questions via chat, email, and telephone. The chat support can come and go throughout the day depending on how heavy the call volume is. Right now it looks like all of our agents are currently on a phone call. That's why there's usually a chat button here, but again, that can go away if everyone gets tied up on a call. And with that said, we're at the end of the lesson. Let me just check the chat to see if there are any last-minute questions. Okay, no last-minute questions. Great. So again, I wanted to thank everyone for joining me today, and if you're able to stick around to the end, thank you for that. I will be sending out a link to the full class recording if you want to review that at a later point. And that email will also include a link to what we're calling the EndNote 20 slide catalog. And if you've got any feedback on that catalog, please let me know. I want to make sure that this is a useful resource, and if there's anything I can do to make it even more useful, I appreciate any feedback. Once you close the session, you will get an after-session survey. If you have any feedback about this session in general or my abilities as a trainer, please feel free to share your feedback. We really appreciate the time you take to submit feedback for any of our sessions. Make sure we're offering beneficial sessions for our users. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Hope you have a great day or a great evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks again. Take care.